From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. September 20, 1999 Observer Newsletter. Eric Bischoff fired from WCW, Beyond the Mat Review. By Dave Meltzer. Although wrestlers were singing Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, Friday night in Baltimore, when the word of Eric Bischoff's reassignment within Turner, read that as a nice way of saying firing, reached the wrestlers, once the initial happiness wore off and reality set in, the reality is little has changed. Bischoff was replaced for a number of reasons, a combination of numerous bad deals and falling ratings, house shows, and buy rates. The company temporarily is in the hands of Bill Busch, whose title has been changed from Vice President of Strategic Planning to Executive Vice President. The creative control at this point is in the hands of television producer Craig Leathers, who has the final say, and the same booking committee headed by Kevin Nash, Dusty Rhodes, and Kevin Sullivan that got the company into this mess, although everyone seems to be jockeying for position to garner power and get creative input. Bischoff was officially relieved of his duties on September 9th. There are some in the company due to the fact Bischoff was so into working everyone on angles stemming from the creativity of the late Brian Pillman, who still at press time thought this is a work, but numerous business maneuvers indicate it isn't. Bischoff tried to repeat elements of the Pillman angle constantly. The Pillman angle itself never drew a dime for the company, although it did garner a lot of attention and fooled a lot of people for several weeks, including even the majority of the wrestlers for a week or two. Because of that, in a business with almost no trust to start out with, there was even less in WCW, creating the environment of constant paranoia in a business that naturally breeds a lot of paranoia to begin with, and justified in many cases. The most notable work was trying to fool the boys last year into thinking Hulk Hogan, who at the time was hated by most of the wrestlers for keeping himself on top and holding back younger talent, was retiring after Bischoff decided to go with Kevin Nash as booker. The change, causing morale to go way up, was that Nash had so much heat with Hogan that Hogan would quit, when it turned out the two had been working together, with the imaginary angle allowing Nash to gain power in exchange for agreeing not to threaten Hogan's spot as the big star of the company. No exact reasons have been given for the move, which virtually everyone felt was necessary and eventually going to happen, although it happened a few months earlier than expected. Bischoff right now has returned home to Wyoming, waiting for a reassignment within the Time Warner Company, since he has several years left on a large contract. It is being portrayed in some circles as him getting a promotion, but the reality is something different. He may be offered a buyout on his contract. Bischoff's overall track record with WCW going into 1999 was excellent, although in hindsight many would say there was a lot of luck involved. He took the company from a $30 million a year company when he took the helm in 1993, which was averaging about $6 million annually in red ink, to a company which in 1998 grossed approximately $200 million and garnered a $55 million profit. He was the person most responsible for the creation of the current wrestling boom. But his ideas were almost always short-sighted, with little long-term planning, and the result was a collapse of the boom. Expecting revenue to continue at that rate in 1999, and with all facets of business hitting a major decline, the company is going to have to struggle to break even this year. There were some firings to lessen payroll expenses, and more are expected, including some highly paid major names. Bischoff was blamed for making bad deals in a desperate attempt to turn the ratings around, from the $1 million giveaway on Nitro, which was one of the first things to have the plug pulled on, to the Master P debacle, to ratings disasters like signing Kiss and Megadeth for $500,000 and $250,000 for one shot, to the $1 million Dennis Rodman deal, which resulted in another poor buy rate, and down the line. At the same time, the gap between the WWF and WCW was spreading, and adding insult to injury, Chris Jericho, who many of the headliners in the company had convinced Bischoff could never be effective as more than a mid-card player, signed with WWF and almost immediately became one of their most overperformers. With the company falling behind in many ways because it had an aged feel, with virtually every headliner except Bill Goldberg being near or past 40, the result was to give a bigger push to the older wrestlers like Hogan and Savage, whose status as the most pushed stars with the company led to the problem to begin with. In recent weeks, he had taken on almost a Jekyll/Hyde personality from the pressure of being unable to turn things around. When the company was doing well, His personal perks like the Road Wild pay-per-view weren't looked at. But when the revenues were falling, giving away a pay-per-view house gate didn't add up. Still, Bischoff's impact on the industry as a whole can't be overlooked. Simply put, he changed the entire face of pro wrestling as we know it. He took a company that was literally on the verge of folding, and turned it into around completely. He took an industry in which every major company was operating in the red and Japan was clearly the economic center of the wrestling universe, and changed the landscape, with help of strong economy in the US and a depression in Japan, to where the industry is larger financially than it has ever been and the US is clearly the global leader. He came up with the idea of doing Nitro, head-to-head with Raw, which most thought he was insane for trying and would certainly cost him his job. The idea of Nitro at the time almost made him a laughingstock in the industry on how Vince McMahon would hand his ass to him. The formula of presenting a house show, in the days when big matches were saved for house shows and TV was just to get the characters over in squash matches and interviews, and sometimes a pay-per-view quality lineup for free was against the grain of the industry, but by presenting stronger matches. Nitro was able to duel evenly with the established Raw for about 9 months. Then came the NWO angle, a New Japan concept that Bischoff saw during the height of the New Japan vs. UWFI feud at a Tokyo Dome show. Levin brought in Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, whose WWF contracts were expiring, and offered them what looked at the time to be ridiculously high contracts, $750,000 per year, and formed the NWO, doing a heel turn that saved Hogan's career that looked to be at its end, and signed the best young workers in the business so WCW provided an in-ring product its competition, relying on its trademark big slow guys, couldn't compete with. The result was WCW turned its business around, for a short time was on fire, and dominated the ratings for most of the next 2 years to the point McMahon was nearly brought to his knees on the verge of being cancelled by the USA Network. McMahon, through the popularity of Steve Austin, who Bischoff had fired in 1995 deeming him too colorless, and the creation of DX and the special effects ring introductions, and taking the more crude antics that Bischoff had popularized nationally after Paul Heyman introduced them, to a level neither Bischoff nor Heyman could have ever imagined, reinvented what wrestling was. Bischoff, out of ideas, and unwilling to change from the formula that at one time worked great, relying on an aged crew getting older by the day, against a youthful-looking and youthful-oriented product, which saw the viewer slowly, and then more rapidly, drift to his competition. But the loss of Bischoff has done little to really change the landscape other than bad business deals that affected the bottom line have been dropped. On the surface, the idea of putting a numbers guy in charge of a company that is falling into the red makes perfect business sense. But wrestling isn't a normal business. Most businesses can expect a certain amount of revenue and can budget for it. Pro wrestling is entirely different, as a weird amalgamation of sports and entertainment. It's almost a feast and famine cyclical industry. When things are hot, even the stupidest ideas work. When things are cold, you practically can't give tickets away. When you book with no fresh ideas in a constantly changing world, you get left behind quickly, and one day, like happened to WCW about over the past few months, all of a sudden, people stopped buying tickets and ordering pay-per-view events. Tightening the budget without creative changes only ensures a declining business to continue to decline, and if the public sees the product or production of the shows getting weaker, subconsciously, they'll go with who they see will be the winners. The history of wrestling has shown in this country that over the long haul, fans generally only support one company within their city. There have been lengthy and vicious promotional wars, but ultimately, one company is left standing. New companies that build around new younger stars with new ideas eventually overtake the established companies relying on older stars and more traditional patterns. WCW took the lead from WWF through new concepts, when the WWF was asleep at the wheel promoting 1980s wrestling, but it was still always a dogfight. It was always a fight that was going to go to the best conditioned athlete over the long haul, and WCW was every Monday night trying to win that fight by running a sprint, and eventually the lack of long-term planning and lack of creating new stars solved the current problems that have been building from the time the company started succeeding. Busch has been described almost universally as a nice man and an honest man, which if true would make him somewhat unique in a con man business. He started with the company in 1990 as an accountant, and worked his way up to being the man in charge. Some are afraid his lack of background in the creative end of wrestling make him another Kip Frey, one of the many short-lived non-wrestling oriented leaders of WCW. Others are afraid the wrestlers will be able to swerve him with their cons. Others say he knows more about wrestling than people give him credit for. Time will tell on that score. Leathers, who has headed the production crew for WCW, is generally not popular among the wrestlers. There are fears that things will only get more political without Bischoff around, as some of the results and finishes on the pay-per-view indicated. Dr. Harvey Schiller, who oversees with WCW division for Time Warner, went to the pay-per-view on September 12 for a pep talk with the wrestlers in which no questions were really answered. When Schiller was asked about the creative process, the wrestlers were told the same people would be in charge. Schiller did talk about he and Busch opening lines of communications in regard to various Bischoff ideas of late. The proposed New Year's Eve pay-per-view with Kiss was cancelled, even though WCW had already put down a rather large deposit fee to get the date. The Demon Bryan Adams gimmick, which WCW spent $600,000 to get off the ground, has been dropped since it was based on a deal Bischoff made with Gene Simmons. The $1 million giveaway was dropped. The wrestling movie was too far along, and will be produced next month. Bischoff, who was to star in the movie as something of a Vince McMahon character in a terribly scripted story based on what happened to Bret Hart, is out, and will be replaced by Joey Pantalones, an established actor with credits including Risky Business and Midnight Run in one of the leading roles. There will be no more Road Wild pay-per-view shows, although actually that decision was made back in July. A Monday Nitro weekly cartoon segment produced with Jason Hervey and Mandalay Sports Action Entertainment that was scheduled to begin on September 13th, has been cancelled. Many point to Bischoff's close association with Hervey and Mandalay as part of the reason for his departure. There had been serious heat on Bischoff's cutting a bad video deal with Hervey to market the company videos when the feeling is it should have been done in-house, and the videos were embarrassingly bad as compared with WWF home videos. In recent weeks Bischoff had been under fire not only from talent, but from his office staff for refusal to fire one of his personal secretaries who wrote a racial joke that accidentally was seen by the numerous African Americans who work in the office. This after the company has spent money to ease racial relations and the African Americans saw the result as when push came to shove, the easing racial relations was a work. The belief is that within the next few weeks, lengthy booking meets are planned with the idea of booking 3 to 6 months ahead, instead of the booking on the fly every Monday with no long term in mind. It has gotten so embarrassing that local cable companies for the Fall Brawl pay-per-view had to take out newspaper ads from WCW stating we're the advertising agency, and they won't even tell us who's going to be there. For God's sake, hey, don't miss it. Because they didn't decide on the Hogan Sting main event until so late. In fairness, both WWF and ECW now also frequently have no clue where they are going on pay-per-view shows until sometimes a few weeks before the show as well, and on the TV shows until usually just a few days ahead in the case of WWF, and literally the last second in the case of ECW. Bischoff was banned from being backstage at any WCW events and from going to the WCW offices. In addition, no mentions of his name are allowed on WCW broadcasts, which is why Gene Okerlund on Nitro made sure Ric Flair stopped when he was going in that direction. Nor are any clips allowed on television that he is part of in any future historical packages that the company is so fond of putting together. Over the past several days, there were an amazing amount of warm-hearted eulogies written for a man who, one would think looking from an outsider viewpoint, and even from his own personal viewpoint, it wouldn't seem to make sense. In a business that deals with death sometimes on a weekly basis, usually without stopping more than momentarily to take a pause, a referee who the vast majority of wrestling fans wouldn't have known the name of and couldn't have picked out of a police lineup became almost symbolic of everything that can be good about the pro wrestling industry. Brian Hildebrand's credentials in wrestling wouldn't seem large to an outsider. He never had an action figure. He wasn't a household name. He never made huge money in wrestling. He never had major political power behind the scenes. His credentials were more abstract. Sure, he was generally considered the best referee in the business, but that's largely an anonymous job, usually only notable during a really goofy-looking finish or doing a mistimed bump. Unlike the vast majority who enter pro wrestling for, among other reasons, to satisfy their personal quest for attention, Hildebrand felt his role as referee didn't call for it, and was somewhat embarrassed when his real-life role most certainly did. He entered wrestling because he loved wrestling as a kid. Born January 21, 1962 and growing up in Pittsburgh, from the age of 15, he trained under Robert Cortese, who wrestled as Bobby Bold Eagle, in everything from American to shoot style to lucha libre style wrestling. He started out working little indie shows, too small to be a wrestler, in the late 70s. As a gimmick, he sometimes wrestled midgets, women and even bears, but mainly worked as manager Professor Jaime P. Schwartz. He was good at ringside, but not on promos, which was an absolute prerequisite for a manager in those days. He first met Jim Cornette and Eddie Gilbert in 1979 at a Wrestling Fans International Convention in Memphis. He remained friends with them through his college years at the University of Dayton. He became friends with the Dayton area Fright Night television personality who was also a wrestling fan, and they'd travel to matches throughout Ohio in a hearse and he'd shoot photos for various wrestling magazines. He remained on the periphery of the wrestling business, working on indie shows and shooting photos at the big shows. He met Dominic DeNucci at a show while working as a manager, and asked DeNucci if he could train him. DeNucci was starting a wrestling school which included Troy Martin, Shane Douglas, and Mick Foley, along with Mark Keenan, now a local chiropractor and sometimes independent wrestler under the name Cody Michaels. Since he had more experience than the others, he actually helped in the training, and continued as a manager, now as Professor Mark Curtis. Foley, who called Hildebrand his best friend in wrestling, said Hildebrand was like his second teacher. During the late 80s, he traveled with his Ninja Turtle costume doing his flying moves and taking his trademark big bumps as he was actually a very well-respected worker inside the ring, even though he never had the opportunity to seriously go all the way with wrestling. Most weekends, he'd go around the Northeast doing double duty, wrestling and taking off the costume and managing main events, which at times included managing such people as Bruiser Brody, Eddie Gilbert, and Terry Funk. He always had the goal to be like his first teacher and wrestle in Mexico, because that would be the one place where his size wouldn't doom him. Since at that point in time before the introduction of Rey Mysterio Jr. and the removal of the size barrier to the profession, you couldn't wrestle seriously at his size. His first break nearly came when Gilbert was in Kansas City and he was going to come in as Little Eddie, but Gilbert had a blow-up with the office just before Hildebrand was scheduled to start. His love for wrestling wasn't blind to what the realities of the business were. Until 1996, when he got a full-time gig with WCW, he always kept a full-time job working at a shoe store, even during the entire run where he eventually moved from Pittsburgh to Tennessee, transferring to a new shoe store, to work as Jim Cornette's right-hand man in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Maybe that's the secret right there. Because he wasn't phony, and he loved pro wrestling for what it could be, he embodied a spirit that made him one of the most admired men in the profession, although he himself probably never quite understood it. But he was lucky in his time of adversity to find out. Hildebrand, known on WCW and Smoky Mountain Television by his stage name of Mark Curtis, taken from the Dr. Mark Curtis name he used as a Northeast indie manager in the 80s, passed away on September 8 at about 7:15 p.m. after a several-year battle with stomach and bowel cancer at his home in Talbot, Tennessee. He was 37. He wound up in Tennessee after transplanting from Pittsburgh to become Jim Cornette's right-hand man in Smoky Mountain Wrestling in 1992, and remaining there to get married after the territory folded. It was a battle that made him the embodiment of a courageous figure to everyone who had come into contact with him over the past few years. In a business where the nature of it often is to complain about problems in some form industry-related or created, because it's filled with them, Hildebrand's problems were more real and more compelling than virtually anyone's. But he rarely complained about life dealing him an unfair hand. Perhaps his love for wrestling, and for the good friends he made in it, allowed him an outlet to mask what had to have been his own incredible pain, not just physical, of working his entire life to get his dream job with his dream girl and wanting to start a family, and then when he got it, having it taken from him without any logical reason. Even to his friends he seemed almost perplexed about the attention he got for what he tried to portray as a temporary fight, a serious one but temporary one, that he was going to win, and he never stopped talk about returning to work at WCW once his strength came back. Even when down to 76 pounds a few months back, was almost matter-of-fact about what he looked like at that weight, a victim of a Nazi concentration camp, but he still maintained he was beating the odds. He beat the odds once. He contracted stomach cancer in 1997, but it went into remission and the next year returned to refereeing in WCW, although he was down from his regular 140 pounds to about 115. But about 1 year ago, when recurring pain and inability to keep food down he thought was a problem from scar tissue inflamed from previous operations. When opened up, the doctors had found that cancer had returned, more devastating than ever, and spread to the point it was inoperable and his fate was sealed. He was told he had 1 to 3 months to live. Privately, his doctors talked with his friends and weren't even that optimistic. He beat the odds again by lasting 1 year, enough time that a business that's often cold and uncaring could put its best foot forward for him on several occasions. WCW made its next trip to Knoxville on November 29, 1998, a public surprise party for him. His wrestling idol, Ric Flair, gave him the ultimate surprise, hiding from him all night and nobody letting him know an unadvertised Flair was coming, and presenting him with a replica world title belt. Flair told the crowd near his hometown that Hildebrand, and not himself or Hulk Hogan, was really the man. His best friends in the company, Chris Jericho, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero put on one of the company's best matches of the year in the main event matchup that he had always wanted to referee. That night, he barely had the strength to jump from ringside and count to 3, tear off his shirt to reveal a Four Horsemen shirt for the big babyface pop to end the show. After it was over, he thought it all almost strange. He was absolutely blown away by everyone, but it was also almost like attending his own funeral. Wrestling rarely did things like this, and when it did, it was virtually always after the person being honored has passed away. Pro Wrestling Illustrated in 1998 named him Pro Wrestling Man of the Year. It wasn't the first time they gave such an award, which isn't an annual thing, but it was the first time it was given for other than political reasons. He eventually did return to refereeing, doing some indie shows in the area and most notably, refereeing a Conan and Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Benoit and Malenko main event on the memorial show for Brian Pillman in Cincinnati. Leigh Thatcher gave Hildebrand an introduction, calling him the most courageous man he had ever met, that resulted in him getting a very impressive and heartfelt standing ovation, the largest crowd reaction of the night from a crowd that 5 minutes earlier didn't even know his name. Hildebrand's reaction in a business where most wrestlers in their entire careers dream of a pop like that and few ever get it, was to try and be as inconspicuous as possible. Thatcher wanted him to say a few words, as did the fans, but he didn't milk his sudden spotlight for even a second, waving it off and not wanting to get in the way of the crowd responding to the main event wrestlers. When it was over, it was almost miraculous he was in the ring in the first place, moving around to the point, except that he was quite thin. You'd never know anything was wrong, despite having been unable to eat what you and me would consider a real meal in many months. But in keeping up with a fast-paced match, he was disappointed in his own performance because he got winded early and was a little slow as the match wore on, and felt he'd somehow hurt the match, although he was the only one thinking that. Political barriers that the biggest corporations in America couldn't knock down were removed in order to give him a fitting tribute show near his hometown of Pittsburgh, in nearby Rostraver, Pennsylvania on July 30th, which raised some $30,000 for pay for his rising medical bills. His friends within wrestling were invited from around the country. Technically, Chris Jericho's first match under a WWF contract was there. Bruno Sammartino was even there. Many of his co-workers at WCW came, while the WWF allowed Foley, D'Lo Brown and Al Snow, the latter two whom Hildebrand befriended while working for Smoky Mountain, to miss their scheduled house show booking, paid their way to the show, despite the fact Hildebrand never spent one day working for the company and was actually with the hated rival organization. Probably because of people like Foley, Brown, Snow, Kane and others who worked Smoky Mountain, his name had become well known in the WWF locker room despite never having worked there. One night of a Raw taping not that long ago, Hildebrand called up Foley on his cell phone in the dressing room to tell him he'd gotten his weight up to 121 pounds, and Foley spread the word and there was a loud cheer. As in maybe that number was a sign that what everyone deep down knew was reality, was really going to be avoided. Hey, it had been almost a year, and he wasn't supposed to last 3 months, and outwardly, he seemed to be getting better. It's a story that's been printed elsewhere before, but it bears repeating, particularly since it's my last memory of ever seeing Hildebrand. It was about 2:15 or 2:30 a.m. the night of his show. He and his wife were leaving the hotel restaurant where most of the wrestlers had hung out, and were about to go to bed, and he just said goodnight to me. Chris Benoit, who was a few feet away, and who had become one of his best friends while the two worked the past few years in WCW, met eyes with him. It should be noted that just a few weeks earlier, Hildebrand was scheduled to return to WCW for the big Georgia Dome event as a referee. He drove in from Knoxville, but weakened by the cancer, he was exhausted and got a 103-degree fever. He couldn't move from the couch at Benoit's house. He never did return to Nitro. Benoit was really freaked, as his frail frame being so ill seemed like a sign the end was near. You could see Benoit's eyes tear up. Having seen him so full of life and talked with him where he hadn't, since the original prognosis, ever seemed that close to death, even after the Atlanta incident a few weeks earlier, which he passed off to me the next day as just a temporary setback, and he'd be back on Nitro in a few weeks. It almost made me forget why it was we were all there. But Benoit knew too well, and suddenly, I was jolted back to reality. Hildebrand looked right at him and said, "What's wrong?" "I'll be back at work in a few weeks. And don't forget we'll be going on that vacation together. I think it was to the Rocky Mountains." And then he left. All I could think was, all these really tough men in this really tough business I've been around for most of my life, and that 110-pound guy was the toughest of all of them. And one of the nicest. And those tributes weren't because of anyone feeling they had to do them because of feeling some form of personal guilt. which, quite frankly, has been the case at some others, but because everyone involved simply wanted to be there for their own different reasons. Most wrestling fans are probably still wondering why so much has been said in the past week, or why they saw the referees in armbands with a gun, an idea of Bobby and Cindy Heenan, for his shooter nickname given when he almost calmly, like it was just another quick move to counter near fall, grabbed a much larger fan who bypassed security and made it to the ring on Nitro in a front choke and subdued him, and saw the same death mentioned on Thunder Saturday night and a pay-per-view, and days earlier saw the same guy mentioned, albeit with different names, on Raw and Nitro, in a business where death has become far too routine, and running from those deaths as quickly as possible has become almost a cruel art form. This is still a profession where wrestlers every fan knows from TV, with all those championship title histories or famous grudge matches, pass away every week, usually with little or no mention at all on television, or if they were big names of the past decade, maybe a quick 3-bell salute or brief video clip with their names never mentioned again on television, as if everything they did in the past was no longer relevant since they were doing nothing more in the future. HILDEBRAND isn't the only member of WCW's small referee corps who once beat cancer, nor in fact, is he the only one that died this year. I can't give a reason for why this is, other than it is. Maybe because he was a friend to so many. Maybe because he was in no way a larger-than-life fantasy creature, but someone who deserved a lot better and represented different real things to different people, as opposed to people who are best known by most as an image from television. The closest thing to an explanation came from Thatcher, who worked with him in the Smoky Mountain days as a television announcer. He said that HILDEBRAND was one of those guys who, if you were his friend, and you met someone who was also his friend, just because of him, the two of you would become immediate friends based on his recommendation. His last appearance in a pro wrestling ring was as a referee on August 28 in Cookeville, Tennessee on an independent show. He was having major stomach problems. Apparently there were 2 blockages, and the doctors said that because of his condition, he wouldn't be able to survive surgery and there was nothing more that could be done. His stomach started painfully expanding for the last week. As mentioned, Foley, Douglas, and Keenan all flew in to see him one last time. D'Lo Brown was flying back from television on Wednesday, stopping in Tennessee on the way home, but just before he got there, BRYAN had passed away. His funeral was held in Morristown, Tennessee on September 11. Jericho, Malenko, Foley, and Thatcher were among those who eulogized him, along with his doctor, talking about his strength as a patient, and the most emotional was Casey O'Connor, who he actually had problems with when both worked for Smoky Mountain, but they had long since buried their differences. Among those also attending were Keenan, Bill DeMott, Hugh Morris, Eddie Guerrero, Terry Taylor, Jimmy Richland, Jimmy Del Rey, Mike Durham, Johnny Grunge, Ted Allen, Chris Benoit, Nancy Sullivan, Perry Sotelo, Perry Saturn, Alan Sarvin, Al Snow, Tim Horner, Tony and Kim Anthony, Dirty White Boy and Dirty White Girl, Dean Roll, Shark Boy, Bo James, WCW ring announcer Dave Penzer, and referees including Nick Patrick, Charles Robinson, Scott Dickinson, and former referees Ron West and Mac McMurphy, along with independent area promoter Terry Landell. At the end, when Bette Midler singing The Wind Beneath My Wings from the movie Beaches, everyone went to pieces. Several years ago, Barry Blaustein, a Hollywood comedy writer with many connections within the pro wrestling world, and credits that include writing for Saturday Night Live and the movie Nutty Professor, had an idea of doing a movie he envisioned to give respectability to pro wrestling as an art form similar to what the 1970s movie Pumping Iron did for the bizarre world of bodybuilding, and springboarded the career of Arnold. But for nobody involved in the movie, did the end product turn out anything resembling what the original ideas were. Since the idea for the movie, pro wrestling has gotten far too big for a movie to delve backstage as The Secret Society. Every little secret, both charming and otherwise, that would have been revealed to the general public, has been written about ad nauseum in nearly every mainstream periodical. Pro wrestling is grudgingly in some circles accepted as a legitimate, perhaps low-class but certainly not low-rent, form of theater. Most of what takes place backstage is no longer hidden from anyone who really wants to know bad enough. The movie changed form several times over the years, and it's just as well. Beyond the Mat, which will be released next month, is a far better movie than Pumping Iron was, or a remake with slightly eccentric charming dedicated wrestlers in place of slightly eccentric charming and dedicated bodybuilders would be. And it's far more powerful than Wrestling with Shadows, which gave even the most ardent fan their first real look at the behind-the-scenes machinations of the World Wrestling Federation, and has won numerous awards at various documentary film festivals. Imagine Entertainment financed the film largely as a favor to Blaustein, making his directorial debut, for his previous work as a writer for the company, with little intention of it being more than a triviality. After seeing the almost finished product a few weeks back, their attitude has changed as well. Now it's being rushed out for a one-week run starting October 22nd at the AMC Century City Theaters in Southern California, in order to qualify for a possible Academy Award nomination. And for the stars of the movie, largely Mick Foley, Terry Funk and Aurelian Smith Jr., Jake the Snake Roberts, it's doubtful the finished product is what they expected it to be either. The movie was supposed to be Blaustein's story about learning about the people that intrigued him the most in his secret hobby, the one he never admitted to having to his friends. Exactly what pro wrestling is and isn't, as far as the reality issue, is nicely done away with in the first minute of the film, and little time is wasted on it again. His message is that while the end results, the personalities, the soap opera and angles are all scripted, and that basically everyone knows that anyway, far more often than most realize, the pain often isn't. As it turns out, as the movie goes on, the pain is both inside and outside the ring, most notably to the families of the performers. The movie starts out with a behind-the-scenes look at the creation of a new character, Blaustein, whose crew was granted full access to the WWF, ECW and some smaller independent groups, with the usual agreements with WWF that people like Undertaker and Kane couldn't be filmed out of character. Eric Bischoff decided not to cooperate with the project because, as things would have it, at the time he thought his company was number one and the WWF at the time was number two, and being number two usually makes one slightly more humble and usually a lot nicer about cooperating with something you aren't given final creative say over. As it turned out, that was just as well, because the movie turned out far better than the same old Vince McMahon versus Ted Turner media fantasy story revolving around often fictitious accounts of a real promotional war. The new character the WWF was creating that day was Puke, the very short-lived gimmick of Darren Drozdov, who's still around after the first character didn't pan out, under the name Droz. Vince McMahon was in his office with Drozdov, his son Shane and Jim Ross, explaining using his unique ability to vomit as well as the basis for this characterization would make Drozdov into a television star. He then pulled out a garbage can, put it on his desk, and ordered Drozdov to demonstrate his talent. Drozdov, a former college football star from a well-to-do family, demonstrated it to his new boss, who was going crazy, almost doing his trademark overhyped voice pro wrestling play-by-play of the scene. He's gonna puke. Drozdov then called up his mother after his job interview, telling her that he got the job. They went to a wrestling school, Roland Alexander's all-pro wrestling school in Hayward, California, to follow the fledgling careers of two of his best prospects, Michael Modest and Tony Jones. A funny scene interspersed Jones talking about his matches and his payoffs for the Hayward gym shows $25 if you have a good match. You don't get paid if you have a bad match. Then Alexander comes back claiming that everyone gets paid and how he's one of the best payoff men of all the independent promoters. Alexander also makes it clear that to be a successful wrestling promoter, you have to be a prick. Modest, who at the time was working at a funeral home as a regular job and living in a room above the gym where he was the head instructor, was there talking about his skills. His self-evaluation was pretty honest. He thought he was far more cut out for Japanese wrestling with its emphasis on skill and athletics than American wrestling with its emphasis on theatrics. Largely as a favor for the movie project, Ross agreed to give Modest and Jones a tryout when the WWF taped television in nearby Sacramento. It noted that backstage before the match, Alexander seemed more nervous than his two wrestlers, noting that if either gets signed by the WWF, that per his contract, Alexander receives 20% of their earnings. As the two wrestle in the opening match, various WWF personnel watch, none more intently or enthusiastically than Jim Cornette, who clearly believes in their ability and is singing their praises to everyone within earshot as they are in the ring, and Ross, who seems more stoic. McMahon walked in for a quick look, and was far more condescending. When Jones did a bridging suplex, McMahon praised his bridge, but was almost denied, saying that's something new for us, a wrestling move, as if that was almost something dirty. When Modest delivered a Fisherman Buster, a maneuver McMahon may have never seen before, McMahon reacted like he'd just seen a green guy hurt his fellow wrestler by badly screwing up a move. When they did another move nobody has seen, something similar to a Mitsuharu Misawa move, Cornette's reaction to something he'd never seen before was to put it over, while one of the wrestlers watching talked about wanting to steal the move. Ross' evaluation was that Modest was a solid worker and that Jones had potential, and told Jones he needed to add some upper body mass, and wear a more flattering ring costume, to get in the hunt. As it turned out, the WWF never called either man back. As it turned out, a later movie scene was almost identical, although it didn't involve wrestling. It was New Jack getting a tryout in Hollywood, as the casters fawned all over him debating whether or not he had leading man potential. And despite all the praise, he also never got past square one. The movie moved on to Amarillo, Texas, where Blaustein said he was for the first time in his life going to meet with a legend. Terry Funk was portrayed as a contradiction, a nice warm-hearted emotional man who in the ring portrayed unbridled violence. Blaustein said that Funk was his favorite wrestler growing up because he was so believable at playing the role of a violent, crazed wrestler. At the wedding of one of his daughters, he started learning about the flip side of Funk from his family, a 53-year-old man who couldn't walk away. His family echoed that they all wished he would retire. One of his daughters said she wished he would have 10 years earlier, and his wife echoed similar sentiments. They showed him having a knee examination, where the doctor told him he needed an artificial knee and the injuries to his bad knee should already be disabling. Whether he retired or not at that point, he was destined to live the rest of his life insignificant. Clips of one of Funk's many retirement matches, this one in Amarillo against Bret Hart, were shown. There is also brief footage of Funk's most famous retirement ceremony, this one in Tokyo back in 1983. Funk was then showed at the first ECW pay-per-view show, with Paul Heyman making his pep speech before the show thanking Funk for all he had done to help build the company. Blaustein described ECW as being like a commune, when showing the residential house where the wrestlers and production people congregate early every week to produce the television show. The company at that time put on a banquet in Funk's honor, which saw Funk announce that by the end of 1997, he was retiring from wrestling. Jake Roberts was almost like a mystical figure, like this movie or theatrical legend who disappeared from view and nobody could find him. Blaustein spent a week with Roberts driving to independent shows, including a scene of Roberts meeting up with his first daughter in Kansas, whose life he hadn't been a part of, and who he hadn't even seen in 4 years. Roberts, looking far older than his 43 years of chronological age would indicate, was cold and unemotional in dealing with a daughter who at different times in her life hated her father for never being there. But clearly it had affected him on the inside. Roberts, who was talkative 24 hours a day up to that point, didn't say a word the next day in the car going to the next city. When he got there, he disappeared for several hours. When Blaustein found him in his room, he was almost incoherent, mumbling in a crack-induced stupor. And since that brief meeting a few years ago, he's never seen his daughter again. Roberts talked about his own bizarre past, but saying the person he hates the most in this world is the person he sees when he looks in the mirror. He noted how much he hated his father for not being there for him. Now, 24 years later, he's become the same person. He talked about being conceived by the 13-year-old daughter of his father's then-girlfriend. His father, a locally well-known pro wrestler named Grizzly Smith, was never there for him. His sister wound up marrying a much older man, and was then murdered, although the body was never discovered. Roberts claimed he spent his childhood wanting to get his father's approval, but no matter what he did, he could never get it. He then went into his father's profession to impress his dad, and his dad still wasn't impressed. He then dedicated his life to becoming a much bigger star in wrestling, a business he didn't even like than his father ever was, for the express purpose of sticking it to him and ruining his own life in the process. The footage was nothing short of amazing. Indeed, Blaustein actually had to tone down the portrayal of Roberts, as the initial portrayal included footage too powerful. The audience would wind up hating Roberts to the point they wouldn't even care about him. But without question, the star of the movie was Foley and his family, in particular camera-friendly young daughter Noelle. The famous teenage clips of Foley playing pro wrestler for his friends, who lived out his lifelong dream to be a pro wrestler, wound up achieving more success in it than he could have ever imagined. There was an amazing contrast with him as well. An intelligent one of his teachers in college said that Foley was the second smartest student he had ever taught, polite man with an obviously loving family life, who on the flip side would put his body through incredible stunts and willingly take inhuman damage to deliver the high for his loyal fan base, who he somewhat envisions as being like himself when he was a teenager idolizing the wrestlers. Foley is a man who was given a gimmick pulling a sock out of his pants, that due to has accrued goodwill among the fans, would enable him to get big easy pops without taking his trademark spine-shattering punishment. But even while his body has been ravaged, his pride in delivering the goods for the real fans was such that he didn't want to finish his career as a comedy figure who pulled out a sock as his big move. The bumps from the famed Hell in the Cell match were shown, as was footage from barbed wire matches in Japan. The movie's climax was the controversial finish of the I Quit match against The Rock at this year's Royal Rumble in Anaheim, California. The background of this match's finish was not in the movie, but it originally was to involve Rock threatening Foley's young children, and Foley would quit the match as a blackmailed finish, dropping the title so Rock wouldn't harm his kids. The night before the show, the finish was changed because of the fear that finish would get the WWF too much heat from children's groups, as if you recall, that was the period where numerous television shows and media outlets were already critical of WWF's potential effect on its young children's audience. The new finish involved multiple brain cell destroying chair shots, although it's doubtful it was supposed to be as many or as brutal as it turned out, and a tape being played of Foley saying "I quit." Before the match, Foley is assuring his kids that Rock, who was there playing with them, and Daddy are friends and he's not going to really be hurting Daddy. Footage of Foley backstage before the show reveals a very nervous man, recognizing this wasn't going to be even the typical punishing pay-per-view match he had become famous for. The footage of his two children's hysterical reaction to the finish, the fact was they were so freaked out their mother, whose reaction to it was in its own way just as bad, had to carry them backstage rather than witness the final half dozen or so chair shots, is a vision that nobody seeing the movie will ever forget. It's a chilling reminder that even when they're told differently, young children can't separate fantasy violence from real violence. Foley, whose bloodied visage will make a more powerful statement about the real damage of the sport to non-wrestling fans who aren't as desensitized to people who look like they've just been butchered, was very businesslike after the match, feeling that for every person turned off by the finish, there will be more who were turned on, and after all, that is what the wrestling business is all about. But when seeing the footage of his children's reactions, he felt like a terrible father whose priorities were out of whack and said he would never subject his children to anything like that again. Nothing is worth that was his reaction to watching the footage, and all of a sudden finishing his career with his big move being pulling a sock out of his pants didn't seem as abhorrent to him professionally as before. It should be noted that while Foley's children were unable to watch the finish of that match, they, and for that matter he, were fine, by pro wrestling standards, which means nobody had to be hospitalized, and whatever physical damage was done to Foley wasn't that severe, at least short term. They left together as a happy family at the end of the night. Needless to say, this is the best movie ever on the subject of wrestling. Unlike Wrestling with Shadows, which was also very good, that was a good wrestling movie that would intrigue non-wrestling fans. This was a people movie, about three unique people who happen to make their living as wrestlers, and will move people who don't even have the slightest interest in pro wrestling. Blaustein's conclusion after examining the various subjects in the movie: who are wrestlers? They're people just like you and me. Except they're not. The first major show under the new WCW regime showed just how far the company had fallen. The annual Fall Brawl event from the Lawrence Joel Coliseum in Winston-Salem, North Carolina only drew 3,347 paid attendance for a live gate of $97,600, both numbers considerably lower than what ECW will do for its pay-per-view event next week in Villa Park, Illinois. There were a total of 7,491 tickets out, with 4,144 freebies around town, although not all those with freebies attended the show. And before the show started, since the building was so empty, they invited fans who were sitting in the cheaper seats to move down to the ringside area so it would at least look decent on camera. The previous 2 years in the same building, Fall Brawl sold out with more than 11,000 paid. The show itself started strong with 2 good matches, and there wasn't another good match the rest of the night. With Eric Bischoff gone, it was the night of the head bookers to get back at those who had complained, or were envisioned as Bischoff's pets. Thus, Vampiro, considered a Bischoff pet, was asked to do a job in the opener, while the Revolution, who had heat with the bookers by going over their head to Bischoff to get at least one finish changed in recent weeks, were given the major humiliation, an interview where Perry Saturn guaranteed they'd clean sweep in their 3 matches, and then instead garner little offense in any of their matches en route to clean losses. The biggest news was the Sting heel turn, capturing the WCW title from Hulk Hogan. Turning Sting had been considered for several weeks, in lieu of the originally planned Hogan heel turn. Since Sting hasn't been a heel since so early in his career, when he formed a tag team with Eddie Gilbert and Rick Steiner as Hot Stuff International 1986 to 1987, that nobody even remembers it, the idea of him turning isn't bad. But my feeling is the timing of it was. There have been so many turns in WCW that, like the 1988 version of the Jim Crockett Company, and the similarities between the two for anyone who studies history are staggering, right down to Dusty Rhodes in the Hulk Hogan position not allowing new talent to rise to the top, that when they finally turned the perennial babyfaces heel, in that case Road Warriors on Dusty Rhodes, Lex Luger and Sting, it meant nothing at the box office because fans had seen so many turns so quickly that no turns could make them care. Fans stopped coming, and the only reason the company avoided bankruptcy is because Ted Turner bought it to retain highly rated television programming. The point here is that for the Sting turn to mean anything, it would have been best to hold off all turns for several months so a turn would seem like something new, and then when it was Sting, it would mean something. 1. Rey Mysterio Jr., Oscar Gutierrez, and Eddie Guerrero and Billy Kidman, Peter Gruner beat Vampiro Ian Hodgkinson, and Insane Clown Posse Joe Bruce and Joey Ulster, in 14-14. This was a good match, but it wound up a mess. Mysterio Jr. bleached his hair. The small crowd was hot and it was largely a good match. The match ended up with 2 injuries. At one point Shaggy did a really high leg drop off the top on Guerrero with his leg landing on Guerrero's face, which seemed to look worse than it really was. Vampiro whipped Mysterio Jr. into the guard rail and Mysterio Jr. legit injured his knee, which was bleeding through, and he couldn't walk, although he was fine the next day and available to wrestle on Nitro and was scheduled in a match later cancelled. When Kidman and Guerrero came back on Vampiro, they were unusually stiff, but it was still within the guise of cooperation. Apparently this match also went longer than it was supposed to. There were some hot moves toward the finish, including a double team move that was totally messed up on Guerrero. Vampiro did a gut wrench off the top rope and Guerrero came back with a missile dropkick on Vampiro. The finish saw Kidman pin Vampiro after a shooting star press, but on landing, his knee landed right on Vampiro's nose, breaking it, and apparently injuring his left eye, which may have had a broken eye socket. Mysterio Jr. had to be carried from the ring. Neither Mysterio Jr. nor Vampiro were able to wrestle on Nitro, although Mysterio Jr. was able to walk within a noticeable limp and Vampiro did commentary. 3.25 stars. Before this match, Revolution did an interview with Saturn guaranteeing a clean sweep. I knew things looked really bad for them after that one. 2. Lenny Lane pinned Kaz Hayashi in 12:09 to retain the WCW Cruiserweight title. This was a tremendous match, the type of which usually doesn't get noticed because neither wrestler is taken seriously. Lenny and Lodi are calling themselves the West Hollywood Blondes, and it appears they've studied tapes of Adrian Street. Lane's mannerisms are total 1980s Street, and the old Hollywood Blondes of the 70s, Buddy Roberts and Jerry Brown, who did the same semi-gay hugging routines, although I have no idea where anyone would find many tapes of those guys. Hayashi looked great. He did a running twisting dive over the top early. He did a second dive, the great Sasuke trademark running flip dive over the top. Hayashi had a bloody nose. There were great near falls by Hayashi, including a Hurricane Rana, a running Liger bomb with Lodi putting Lenny's foot on the ropes, and a flying Hurricane Rana off the top rope. After a distraction from Lodi, Lenny got a near fall using a schoolgirl I've been waiting for that one before getting the pin with a reverse Russian leg sweep. Even though neither man has any credibility with the audience, Lane and Lodi have opening match recognition but nobody takes them seriously. The match was so good the crowd got into it anyway. At this point, this was looking like a really good show. 3.75 stars. Gene Okerlund interviewed Sting. It was funny because Sting said he thought Hogan was shooting straight with him, and the crowd booed. They telegraphed title change by pushing so hard Sting was going for his 9th world title win, and they never give numbers like that in the past. He also mentioned the name of Ric Flair. I have no clue why at no point during this broadcast they never mentioned that Flair would be at Nitro. Maybe they were afraid it might be worth 1/10 of a point on the rating. 3. Hugh Morris, William DeMott, and Brian Knobbs, Brian Yandrosavitz, beat Dean Malenko, Dean Simon, and Shane Douglas, Troy Martin, in a no DQ match in 9:26. Douglas definitely has to drop that half shirt. It was hilarious, was Douglas said. Saginaw, Michigan, are you ready? When they were in Winston-Salem, crowd quieted down for this match, which wasn't good. Douglas, who because of his injuries doesn't sell that well, was in most of the way. Malenko got the hot tag, and his hot tag philosophy is really flawed because all he did was punch, and seeing a guy so small beating up guys so big and him going down from singular punches, it would be far more effective visually him doing flying moves for them to bump, pulls down a hot tag in record time. Finish saw Knobbs trip Malenko from outside the ring and Morris got the pin after an elbow drop and a moonsault. 3/4 stars. 4. Rick Steiner, Rob Reach Steiner, pinned Perry Saturn, Perry Sotelo, to retain the WCW TV title in 9:23. This was weird since Steiner dominated the match, kicked out of Saturn's finisher, then won cleanly at the end. I don't know if it comes across at all to casual fans, but Steiner looks scary tough in the ring because of his physical thickness. Steiner won with a bulldog off the top. 2 stars. Okerlund interviewed Hogan, who tried to fool the crowd, and ended up double fooling them and getting no heat live on the finish. He did a heel interview which established him as the heel in the match, although actually nobody live seemed to care about the main event, and then when Sting won, using a baseball bat, the crowd popped like a babyface had won the title, well, not the title, but like a TV title or something. Fans chanted, "We want Flair. Starrcade needs to be Hogan versus Flair for the final time in the century." 5. Berlin, Alex Wright pinned Jim Duggan in 7:58. Uta Ludendorff wasn't there. Berlin was accompanied by this 6'6" looking bodyguard who looks like Dustin Runnels gassed up and without the implants. Actually, Dustin doesn't have implants. Dusty might though. They announced Buff Bagwell hadn't arrived. I can't say for certainty what the actual story was here, other than Bagwell was definitely there, of course. The feeling of most of the wrestlers was that Bagwell complained about doing the job. The booked finish was for Berlin to win due to outside interference from the bodyguard, which wound up being the exact finish they did the next night on Nitro. Duggan didn't know he was going out there until just a few minutes before. Match had some heat because of USA vs. Foreigner, but no heat for the match, which was beyond awful. Berlin had a great TV entrance, but the guy desperately needs a tan. They thought him not having a tan would represent that white Aryan supremacy, but it just makes him look like a jobber with a unique haircut. Duggan made things worse by not selling well. Partially Duggan, due to age and all his injuries and medical problems, can't bump much, but when he would go down, he'd never stay down. It actually got so bad that for about 10 seconds, it turned into a shoot or something vaguely resembling it due to a lack of cooperation. There was a lot of heat afterwards, as if Duggan was put there by the people in power to ruin Wright's debut with the new character. Duggan's version apparently was that he was given so little lead time that he didn't know what he was supposed to be doing. The bodyguard clotheslined Duggan and Berlin won with a neckbreaker, a finish that looked real weak in its context. After the match, they showed Bagwell arriving and Mike Graham yelling at him for missing his match. Bagwell went to the ring to hug Duggan, but Duggan shoved him. -1 star. 6. Harlem Heat, Lane and Booker Huffman, regained the WCW tag titles from Barry and Kendall Windham in 13:05. This is where the commentators lost it. Tony Schiavone kept talking about how he has to be considered the tag team of the 90s because they held the belt so many times. Bobby Heenan then said he thought it should be the Steiners. Schiavone came back and said the Steiners should be the tag team of the 80s. They never even teamed until the summer of 1989. Schiavone then ran down how Barry held all the belts in his career and was a top contender for the world title, seemingly oblivious to the fact Windham once held it. Tony's attempt to be Mike Tenay without the split-second knowledge was far more entertaining than anything in the ring. Kurt Hennig was at ringside interfering. Some mistimed spots with Stevie Ray. I think I write that every time he's in a match. Match was awful, but the finish was at least clever. Ray hot tagged in, but the ref didn't see the tag. Ray kept pounding on the Windhams and finally Hennig cut him off by hitting him with the cowbell behind the ref's back. Kendall went to pin Ray, but ref Billy Silverman wouldn't count, since he didn't think he was the legal man. Kendall got up to argue and was nailed by Booker with a missile dropkick, and Booker pinned him to win the title. 1/2 star. 7. Sid Vicious, Sid Audi won the US title from Chris Benoit in 11:48. Schiavone opened by giving a disclaimer on the winning streak. He said how interfering in others' matches really shouldn't count as wins. He didn't say that losing at almost every house show and frequently on television shouldn't count as wins either. Benoit was wearing an armband in memory of BRYAN Hildebrand, as were all the referees, and Chris Jericho did the same at Raw the next night. Some Goldberg chants. Sid took the single worst bump in the history of pro wrestling for a dragon screw. Benoit is the first man since Shawn Michaels to get a decent match out of this guy, more impressively since Sid told him before the match that he wasn't going to take any of his chops. Vicious threw him around and Benoit came back working on Vicious' knees. Vicious did take a German suplex. Benoit used the crossface twice, with Sid getting to the ropes both times, the second time basically carrying Benoit to the ropes. Benoit missed a diving headbutt and Vicious got the pin after a power bomb. 2¼ stars. 8. Bill Goldberg pinned Diamond Dallas Page Falkenberg, in 9:04. This match had the most heat of anything on the show due to Goldberg. Page was checked before the match and the ref found a chain and some coins. Like they think Page travels anywhere without at least some cash on hand. Goldberg did a few minutes of power moves. Ref Mickey J got bumped early, allowing Page to use an object to make a match out of this. Crowd was really into Goldberg's comeback. Page cut the first one off with a really sloppy looking float over DDT. Goldberg got a near fall with a double arm suplex. Bam Bam Bigelow and Chris Kanyon showed up. Kanyon broke a catering plate on Goldberg's head, which ended up with him getting a decent sized gash on the back of his neck and some scratches. Goldberg came back quickly, hitting Kanyon and Bigelow with a double clothesline and pinning Page after the spear and jackhammer. 2¼ stars. 9. Sting, Steve Borden, won the WCW heavyweight title pinning Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, in 13:55. Bret Hart came out before the match started. They tried to do a scientific match, but it was pretty bad because Hogan moved so slow and the crowd didn't seem into either guy after seeing Goldberg. Hogan threw the first punch and choked Sting with a cord, but even then he wasn't really booed. Sting hit the Stinger Splash twice, but Hogan moved on the third and started his Superman comeback. Page came out with Sting's baseball bat and KO'd ref Nick Patrick, so he couldn't make the count when Hogan leg dropped Sting. Page gave Hogan the diamond cutter, but Hogan kicked out of Sting's pin attempt. Page then gave Patrick a diamond cutter and went after Hogan, but Hart ran in after Page. Bischoff ran in after Hogan but was met with a big boot, and Lex Luger ran in and met the same fate. With Luger cowering in the corner, Sting got the bat and Hogan told him to use it on Luger. Sting instead hit Hogan twice with it while Luger attacked Hart. Sting put the Scorpion on Hogan and the ref stopped the match. Sting got a total face pop. Awful match, but the finish came off well. This was total 1988 Dusty hanging on to the top spot booking. 1/2 star. Just 1 month after numerous public announcements of Taz, Peter Cernurka, signing a 3-year contract with ECW, comes the revelation that Taz is expected by all parties involved to ink a deal with the WWF. The current ECW champion, who is expected to drop the title imminently, with most suspecting the change would take place on the September 19th pay-per-view show, will be staying with ECW through December 31st after a series of agreements that went down involving Paul Heyman, Taz and Vince McMahon. The match is scheduled with Taz vs Masato Tanaka, but it is widely expected that it will turn into a 3-way, although it isn't clear who the third person involved would be, other than it definitely won't be Sabu or Rob Van Dam, and that Heyman still believes his biggest money program over the next year is in Van Dam chasing the champion for months, who originally was programmed as being Taz, although when it looked as though Taz was going to leave, only for him to reach an agreement to stay just before the first TNN tapings in Toledo, that wound up never airing. At that point Heyman had decided to go with Van Dam over Taz as an immediate title change. In addition, 3 new major faces are expected to debut on the pay-per-view show. While both Taz and Paul Heyman have agreed to try and keep the breakup amicable publicly since they have nearly 3 months to work together, behind the scenes obviously there was tremendous friction leading to this. The attempt was to keep the story quiet until after the title changed hands, but in wrestling nothing stays quiet for very long. Apparently the scenario for the title change has been agreed to by all parties, and that this won't wind up like the Bret Hart situation when he was a lame duck champion. WWF sources indicate Taz and his agent, when they went back to the company, complained of being tired of Heyman's dishonesty in dealings and expressed the intentions that he wanted out. Some ECW sources attempted to place the blame for the agreement falling apart on Small, although others recognized Taz ultimately is going to make his own decisions. Taz didn't want to comment on anything until after the pay-per-view show. Jim Ross, who hinted of the story late in the week on the WWF website, talked of a major star apparently headed to WWF that even surprised him, as Ross is in charge of personnel moves and signing talent, but he was bypassed directly for Vince Russo and Vince McMahon on the initial stages of the negotiations. Heyman and Taz had reached a verbal agreement in early August after Taz, through agent Brad Small, had approached both WWF and WCW, both of whom made offers but neither expressing overwhelming interest. While initially reported that Taz had turned down both offers, WWF sources indicate Small had asked for a $450,000 per year offer and they had countered with a $200,000 offer, and Taz at one point confirmed WCW had made a higher offer, but he was realistic enough to see what would happen when he got there and ultimately decided to stay with ECW because he would rather be a big fish in a small pond, and signed an ECW contract, and there was an agreement to a 3-year contract at a price which was significantly above ECW's normal top pay of $156,000 per year. There were delays, largely arguments over points in the contract. Both sides apparently became distrustful of the delays. Although the contract had not been signed, according to Paul Heyman, Taz was getting paid based on the new deal, which would have made him likely the highest paid wrestler in the company. Apparently TNN was insistent that the top talent be signed, so the TNN show didn't come across as a show to expose talent that would then be cherry-picked to appear on rival networks TNT, TBS and USA, particularly having its first world champion on television leave for the WWF. Apparently, after a preliminary discussion where Small had contacted the WWF once again, Taz himself apparently had a discussion with Russo on August 31st, which led to a secret meeting the next day with Vince McMahon. It is believed Paul Heyman found out about the meeting from Taz the next day, which led to a blow-up and Heyman pulling his contract offer, which explains why Taz was asked to put over Sabu last weekend out of the blue. On September 4th, Heyman and Taz met in Daytona Beach, which ended with Heyman wanting Taz to stay through the end of the year to avoid potential legal action since they had agreed to terms and ECW was up to that point paying Taz based on that 3-year agreement. After a lengthy discussion with McMahon, who was insistent that it was Taz who came to them and not the other way around, McMahon agreed to not start Taz until the new year. With the return to a competitive situation on September 13th, plus facing a strong Monday Night Football season opener, both WCW and WWF came out with guns blazing but ending with the same results. Largely through the departure of Bischoff, WCW brought Ric Flair back to Nitro, although the unadvertised appearance made for rare entertaining television, but probably didn't help the ratings much for lack of build-up. WWF brought both Steve Austin, who had returned at SmackDown, and Vince McMahon, establishing the term forever in wrestling terminology as a period of less than 2 months, the latter in a babyface role of protecting his wife from Hunter Hearst Helmsley. The end results were largely the patterns as they've been. Raw delivered a strong 5.96 rating, 5.73 first hour, 6.18 seconds hour considering football was in opposition, and a 9.0 share. Nitro drew a 3.26 rating, 4.07 first hour, 2.85 seconds hour, 2.89 third hour, and a 5.0 share. Nitro's first hour was the highest rating for a first hour of Nitro in several months, which can largely be traced to the appearance of Ric Flair drawing a 4.46 unopposed quarter. Over the head-to-head 2 hours and 6 minutes, the gap was 5.96 to 2.87, or again more than double. The NFL Game, featuring a retirement ceremony for John Elway, drew a 16.12 rating and 27.3 share, and was viewed in nearly 4 times as many homes as Raw and head-to-head in more than 7 times as many homes as Nitro. Raw's star quarters were for Austin. The tease of the first Austin-Helmsley match, which ended with Austin being arrested, drew a 6.31 quarter, and their brawl match to end the show drew a 7.03 rating on the overrun. That overrun destroyed Nitro's Hogan and Hart vs. Sting and Luger match, which head-to-head with Austin vs. Helmsley did a 2.99 rating. With Nitro's main event going head-up with the return of Vince McMahon in the final quarter, the advantage for Raw was 5.77 to 3.28. In all, Raw doubled Nitro in 5 of the 8 quarters, with the biggest advantage at 6.18 to 2.54 coming with the Chris Jericho angle with Curtis Hughes as the masked Gotch Gracie, even though almost nobody watching understood it and neither Jim Ross nor Jerry Lawler told the significance of the name. It was hilarious for insiders, going against the Steiner vs. Benoit match. The closest Nitro came was a 5.18 to 2.79 disadvantage with Linda McMahon, Patterson and Briscoe arguing with Triple H and Chyna going opposite agads Eric Watts vs. Disco when Raw started and Silver King vs. Norman Smiley, both backdrops for Sid Vicious. For whatever reason, Thursday has not been as much of a smashing success for WWF. SmackDown on September 9th, despite strong hype on Raw for a double buried alive match for the tag titles and the return of Austin, dropped slightly to a 3.65 rating, while Thunder inexplicably, largely due to the Goldberg vs. Bigelow match, rose to a 2.15. Even going against predominantly rerun programming, the 3.7 that SmackDown drew on September 2nd ranked at number 81 for the week, falling from number 73 the previous week, out of 119 primetime shows. Again, SmackDown allowed UPN to beat WB 2.3 to 2.2 for last place. SmackDown again only beat WB programming, finishing 14th out of 18 shows on Thursday night. It also still was the highest rated show of the week on UPN. For this past weekend, WWF Livewire drew a 1.8, Superstars a 2.0, Sunday Night Heat a 3.49, starting its expected drop, and WCW Saturday Night did a 1.7. The third ECW show on September 10th drew an 0.9 rating. For Labor Day, Raw from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the Eastern Time Zone, it was on in its regular slot in the less populous Pacific Time Zone. Still beat the rating of Nitro with an almost amazing for the time slot 4.38 rating and 11.0 share, garnering nearly a 15 share for the Triple H vs. Billy Gunn main event. Nitro unopposed in the regular slot did a 4.12 rating, 3.76 first hour, 4.19 seconds hour, 4.41 third hour, and a 6.5 share. Probably the only notable thing is that on an unopposed show, the rating dipped slightly, 4.5 to 4.4, from the Benoit vs. Malenko match to the cage match with Hogan and Goldberg and Sting vs. Vicious and Steiner and Page, one with no opposition. By all rights it should have gone up about a full point. My theory on this is that they pissed so many people off with the Benoit vs Malenko finish after spending so much time building up the creation of a #1 contender, that whatever people tuned in for the main event were offset by people tuning out. But this was people tuning out without even another wrestling show on, which is an even worse sign. The US Open in the Raw time slot drew a 1.56 rating. For the rest of the numbers for Labor Day weekend, Livewire did a 1.7, Superstars a 1.8, Sunday Night Heat did a 2.83 rating, but that number is misleading. It's probably equivalent to really doing about a 3.5 rating, because the show started 30 minutes early in most of the country and didn't air until 11 p.m. on the West Coast. And since there was no advertising of the West Coast air time, very few West Coast fans actually saw the show. WCW Saturday Night tied its all-time record low for a show that spans nearly 3 decades, doing a 1.3. Although it was not the match which drew the crowd, among insiders, the most intriguing match of the Dream Stage Entertainment Pride 7 show on September 12 at the Yokohama Arena pitted the two heavyweight fighters with the best records in the world. Mark Kerr, a powerhouse wrestler who has never gotten a severe test in piling up an unbeaten win streak and almost unanimous acclamation as the top heavyweight in the sport, finally met up with Igor Vovchanchyn, a short, stocky former Russian kickboxer whose lone loss came early in his career. Vovchanchyn hasn't looked as dominant or as impressive as Kerr in compiling his record, but is clearly a gutsy character that always winds up on the winning end. Vovchanchyn's most recent matches hardly made him look like a world beater, winning a very close and controversial decision over much larger Brazilian Carlos Barreto in the Pride ring under Vale Tudo rules, and then losing via knockout after being blistered with low kicks outside of NHB competition when competing out of his element with an elite kickboxer in Ernesto Hoost in K1 rings. The result? You try and figure it out. Officially, it was first ruled a win for Vovchanchyn, but the decision was later changed to a no contest, although the fans in the building weren't notified and wouldn't have known it until reading the newspapers the next morning. But it was a blemish in some form on Kerr's previously spotless record, as he even admitted that had it not been stopped, he would have lost the decision. Kerr apparently went into the fight ill, as he was vomiting before the match. Vovchanchyn bled from above the right eye after taking a solid right hand. But much of the fight was standing, where Vovchanchyn figured to have the advantage. During the second round, Kerr took Vovchanchyn down and got a mount position. But as Kerr tired, Vovchanchyn escaped and actually took down the wrestler, and in holding him down, delivered 2 knees to the head, which are illegal to a fighter who is down under Pride rules, which are similar to the current UFC rules. Kerr, who was not knocked out, didn't move, and the ref felt he was unable to defend himself and stopped the match at 14:45. Kerr got up and started complaining to the referee, saying that he was waiting for the obvious foul to be assessed against Vovchanchyn. Kerr protested, and after a meeting with Pride officials, the referee and Vovchanchyn, while all watching the tape, all parties involved agreed that the correct ruling should have been that Vovchanchyn should have been assessed 2 penalty points for the illegal knees and the fight should have continued. Since the fight was over at this point, the only fair decision would be to rule in no contest. Kerr will take his unbeaten record into the next Pride show on November 21 against Enson Inoue, who was given an easy win earlier in the show against a Tongan boxer named Tuli Kulihapai via armbar in just 1:03. Inoue was the subject of martial arts headlines earlier the week when he was suspended for life from the Shooto organization and relinquished the group's heavyweight title after punching a reporter. After the Kerr-Vovchanchyn match was over, Antonio Inoki came to ringside and shook hands with Vovchanchyn, which seemed to be the idea at that moment to build for a Vovchanchyn vs Naoya Ogawa match, although making that happen would probably require Vovchanchyn agreeing to do the job. The main event on the Pride show, which drew 10,031 fans and aired in Japan on pay-per-view, will have a complete report probably next week, saw Nobuhiko Tada win what is presumed to have been a worked match over fellow pro wrestler Alexander Otsuka of the Ballarts organization via ref stoppage at 11:32. To show how seriously Otsuka was taking this match, he did a pro wrestling match the night before. Also on the show, former UFC heavyweight champ Maurice Smith beat the very first K1 Grand Prix champion Bronco Sikatic in 7:33 with a forearm choke. Much of the match was on the ground, thus nullifying what should have been both men, as kickboxers, best skill. Smith, who trained for ground fighting under Frank Shamrock and more recently Tsuyoshi Kosaka, who was in Smith's corner for the fight, dominated on the ground and won his first match ever via submission, using a forearm choke in a match described as poor. Every other match on the show also included someone with a pro wrestling background. The opener saw Daijiro Matsui, Kingdom Pro Wrestling from the Takata Dojo, win via DQ over Bob Schreiber, formerly with Rings, after an illegal kick of a downed opponent Karl Malenko, currently with Ballarts. lost a unanimous decision after going the 25 minutes time limit against highly ranked Brazilian Wanderlei Silva. Akira Shoji, who appears on the next Pancrase show, won a unanimous decision over Larry Parker, who has worked for Kingdom and USWF in the past, and Kazushi Sakuraba, UWFI Kingdom/New Japan, defeated former UFC competitor Anthony Macias with an armbar at 12:30. Macias on paper was considered an easy opponent for Sakuraba, who wanted to show off and claimed he'd use the double arm suplex popularized by, among others, Billy Robinson, in this shot match. He dominated the match, tried a pro wrestling half Boston Crab, a move that is a legitimate move, and at one point did use a side suplex but couldn't get the double arm suplex. After the match, Alan Goes, who went to a draw with Sakuraba last year and Sakuraba's only blemish in Pride rings, came to the ring to tease a future rematch. Japanese television rundown. September 5, All Japan. 1. Mitsuharu Misawa pinned Yoshihiro Takayama in 1811. This was an interesting match as a legit test for Misawa's working ability against somebody absolutely awful in a long match. Misawa's chest was all cut up, and not in a bodybuilding sense, so he was chopped raw in matches days before this match. Takayama controlled the early portion. Some of his offense looked terrible, but there were a lot of stiff kicks and knees, and Misawa did a masterful job of selling. If anything, you could see in the early portion how Misawa's winces carry matches. The crowd was quiet in the first half but totally intense, staring at the ring. They started picking up, and when they did, there was this botched up spot reminiscent of an indie show. Still, there was a basic problem with this match in that none of the fans thought Takayama could possibly win. Even when Takayama delivered his regular finishing leg drop, the fans popped for the kick out, but not overwhelmingly. Takayama followed with a German suplex, but again the fans really didn't believe. They traded elbows and Misawa threw a killer elbow to the back of the head. He had a tiger driver, and then a series of elbows for the pin. As usual, his elbows looked totally believable. 2.5 stars. 2. Vader pinned Misawa in 7:21. This was a quick high-impact match and a good match, but not at the level of their previous matches, largely due to it being so short. Fans weren't ready for the finish. Vader hit a German suplex and a splash, Big Van Crush, for a near fall about 2 minutes in, then a second splash and more during the match. Misawa came back with a back suplex and then mounted Vader and threw a lot of elbows. Vader came back with his reverse splash, Vader bomb in US, a choke slam, another splash for a good near fall, and finished using a power bomb. The two matches served their purpose, telling the story of Vader getting the clean win in a non-title match to set up the title match on the anniversary Budokan, but having his excuse because he had just wrestled a long match beforehand. 3 stars. Mexico. The 66th anniversary show on September 24th will be headlined by Atlantis, Mr. Niebla, Shocker, and Villano Tercero with masks at stake. Exactly what that means won't be announced until next week, but it could be 2 singles matches, Atlantis vs V3, Niebla vs Shocker, a 4-man elimination match, or a tag team match. The September 17th Arena Mexico show is headlined by El Hijo del Santo and Negro Casas defending the CMLL tag titles against Blue Panther and Dr. Wagner Jr. and a non-stip tag match with Niebla and Atlantis vs Shocker and V3, which will be used to set up the anniversary main event. Plus, Gigante Silva returns to team with Brazo de Plata and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. versus Los Hermanos Dinamita and Apollo Dantes in a 3-on-4 match. That show goes head-to-head with AAA's Pero Arguello Farewell in Mexico City. They pushed hard in the newspapers that due to all the special effects being set up, that Juan de la Barrera gym would only hold 4,021 fans for Arguello's final appearance, so it's a lock to sell out since it's the company's biggest card of the year. Lineup has heavy metal and octagon versus jock made and kickboxer in a prison of death, new type of cage. Match with the final man out of the cage losing his hair or mask, Canek and Arguello and Latin Lover versus Sangre Chicana and Cibernetico and a mystery opponent, Los Atomicos Jr.'s. La Parca Jr. and Pero Arguello Jr. and Blue Demon Jr. and Mascara Sagrada Jr. defending the National Atomicos 4-man team belts against Los Vipers Primera Clase, the first-class Vipers of LLL in the recent Viper split, AAA Moscow and AAA Hysteria and AAA Psicosis and Maniaco, Los Vipers Extreme, Abismo Negro 2 and Electroshock and Pentagon 2 and Gran Apache 1, versus El Alebrije and Felino and Pathfinder and Oscar Sevilla, Los Vados Locos, Charlie Manson and Enigma and Picudo and May Flowers, versus Thai Boxer and Antonio Silva and Street Boxer and Carlos Gutierrez, and Cynthia and Alda and Esther Moreno versus Rossi Moreno and Miss Janeth and Xochitl Hamada. A main angle in AAA is that Cibernetico along with Los Vipers Primera Clase have quit the promotion to form their own promotion called LLL, but this is really just an NWO angle. Two wrestlers died on September 11th and they held a moment of silence for them at the Arena Coliseo show the next day. They were a young indie wrestler named El Luminoso who apparently was a good friend of Atlantis, and 74-year-old Pedro Belanes, real name Pedro Hernandez, who also wrestled as Caballero Tigre but was better known for founding and raising money for the National Association of Retired Wrestlers. Hernandez's son wrestled as Gallo Tapado, who had a famous 1991 feud with Fuerza Guerrera. On that show, Torero beat Moger a hair match with Torero bleeding buckets, which he had the knack for doing. IWRG main event on September 12 saw Paradha Morgan retain the group's IC heavyweight belt, winning February 3 falls over the original Mascara Sagrada. September 10 at Arena Mexico was headlined by Atlantis and Niebla and Brazo de Plata over Villano Tercero and Shocker and Dantes in 2 straight when Atlantis made V3 submit to the torture rack. The tag title match on September 17 was set up in an 8-man match where Casas did a stretcher job for Wagner's Michinoku driver. As expected, Connect regained the UWA heavyweight title, which at one time was a big deal, beating Cadaver de Ultratumba on September 6 in Tehuacan. Connect has dominated the title, holding it somewhere between 11 and 13 times, depending upon the source, dating back to his first win in 1978 over Luthez. Box E Lucha ran a story on Irma Gonzalez, real name Irma Morales, who is Mexico's equivalent to Moolah. According to the story, Gonzalez is 61, but debuted in 1950 at the age of 12, and next year marks her 50th year as a pro wrestler. When La Fugitiva lost her hair, she kept her mask. She wears a Jushin Liger mask, and in the cage match when she was left in, they opened the mask to shave her head but allowed her to retain her mask. All Japan. Mitsuharu Misawa announced on September 14 at a press conference that the operation on Toshiaki Kawada's eye was more severe than expected. The doctor said the nature of Kawada's injuries were to an extent he had never seen before, and after the first operation on September 1, he needed a second operation on September 7. Kawada was released from the hospital on September 13 and will be out of action for the rest of the year, which means he's out of the tag team tournament. The main event for the October 30th anniversary Budokan Hall show will be Misawa vs. Vader for the Triple Crown. Vader will be brought in just for the Budokan show, so he is off the tour. They are also running a big show on October 23 in Nagoya, which will be headlined by Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa defending 2 of the 3 tag titles, PWF World and International, against Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama. Misawa also officially announced that he and Ogawa were vacating the All-Asian Tag Team titles, and there would be a tournament for the belts on the October tour. There is a fan appreciation show on September 18 at Korakuen Hall with a lineup supposedly chosen at random. The Gladiator and Too Cold Scorpio were both considered successes on their first tour and are wanted back. Gladiator showed up in the best condition of his career and Scorpio in the best shape in many years. The deal is for financial reasons. All Japan is expecting to cut back on dates for some of its foreigners. Misawa as president has been learning the economics, and Motoko Baba, who is still financing the company, doesn't want to put the money into it that was put into it in the past. The result looks to be rotating the foreign wrestlers rather than using the big stars on every tour. Vader only working Budokan on this tour may be the first sign of this. Motoko Baba works in the office but rarely if ever attends the shows anymore. August 29 TV show did a 2.7 rating. New Japan. Several more matches were announced for the October 11 Tokyo Dome show, including the Naoya Ogawa vs. Shinya Hashimoto main event. They are trying to backstory this thing as a business deal to make it seem like UFO and New Japan still hate each other, where UFO will let Ogawa do the match in New Japan in exchange for New Japan sending UFO wrestlers for their shows in North Korea later this year. The general company feeling is in some ways they could do without Inoki, but the feeling is since Inoki was the name who made the company and was the face of it for so long, that Inoki actually having no involvement with them even as a symbolic figure would turn the company heel in the public's eyes. Even though Tatsumi Fujinami really doesn't have much power, Choshu and Nagashima really run the company. He's publicly in the babyface position because he's been a natural babyface for 20+ years. Other matches announced were Kazuyuki Fujita vs. Sean McCulley, a guy who has done several shoot fights without much success. Kendo Kashin vs. Jushin Liger. This wasn't announced as a title match because Kashin has to beat Tatsuhito Takaiwa to keep the title on September 23. Yuji Nagata vs. Kimo, of UFC fame, and Satoshi Kojima and Scott Norton vs. Don Fry and Masahiro Chono. This adds to the previously announced Keiji Muto vs Manabu Nakanishi for the IWGP Heavyweight title, Genichiro Tenryu vs Kensuke Sasaki, Atsushi Onita may be in Tenryu's corner, which logically would lead to Riki Choshu in Sasaki's corner to start their angle going, and an IWGP Tag title match with Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani defending against Koji Kanemoto and Minoru Tanaka. They announced that Atsushi Onita would not be appearing on the card, but are continuing angles that seem to lead to Onita and Tenryu vs Riki Choshu and Tatsumi Fujinami on the January 4th Tokyo Dome show. In Japan, Inoki has claimed he's trying to get Jesse Ventura to go to North Korea as a special guest on his wrestling shows there. He did get Muhammad Ali to attend his 1995 show in North Korea. The G1 Tag Team Tournament opened on September 10th in Omiya before 2,500 fans with Norton and Muto over Junji Hirata and Shiro Koshinaka in 13-12 when Muto used the figure 4 on Hirata. Nagata and Nakanishi beat Bryan Johnston and Takashi Iizuka when Nakanishi used the torture rack on Johnston. Satoshi Kojima and Hiroyoshi Tenzan beat Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto, and finally Fry and Chono beat Fujita and Sasaki when Fry used the choke on Fujita. The second show on September 12th in Hamamatsu before 3,500 saw Fujita and Sasaki over Goto and Ohara, Fry and Chono over Johnston and Iizuka, and Meng and Hashimoto over Kojima and Tenzan. 1-1 September 13th in Niigata before a sellout 3,800 saw Hirata and Koshinaka. 1-1 over Fujita and Sasaki. 1-2 Orton and Muto. 2-0 over Iizuka and Johnston. 0-3 Goto and Ohara. 1-2 over Meng and Hashimoto. 1-1 and Nagata and Nakanishi. 2-0 over Fry and Chono. 2-1 more on the August 28th Jingu Stadium show. I guess the bombs themselves, which it was described, sounded more like loud farts than explosions, made the Muta vs Nita match come off even worse live than it did on television. I didn't think that was even possible. Regarding the Takada deal, the heat on New Japan was that Takada cancelled on August 19th, but New Japan didn't announce it until several days later. Most objective observers of the situation are blaming the problem on New Japan announcing the match before actually signing Takada to a contract, because that's how wrestling was done for so many years in Japan, and the US for that matter. They figured since Takada is a pro wrestler that they didn't need to actually have a contract. Takada never got the contract and signed instead with DSE for another match. Takada was supposed to do the job for Sasaki, but more than that, the big problem leading to the split seems to have been New Japan trying to cut back on the original money deal. They had a verbal agreement for Takada to work 2 dome shows, losing on the first and winning on the second. DSE announced that any fan with an unused ticket for the August 28th Jingu Stadium show would be able to bring it to the Yokohama Arena and get a free ticket, so there may have been some paper out on the Pride show. I doubt many people who bought tickets to Jingu didn't go since the building looked packed. UFO had looked into running an event at the UC Irvine campus near Los Angeles, but the administration turned them down. Apparently they thought UFO was promoting a UFC-like show. The August 28th television show from Jingu Stadium, which aired at 2 a.m. drew a 2.9 rating, peaking at 4.8 for the Muta vs Nita match. Other Japan notes. Kyoko Hamaguchi, the daughter of longtime pro wrestler Higo Animal Hamaguchi, 21, captured her 3rd straight World Women's Freestyle Wrestling Championship on September 12 in Sweden at 165 pounds, beating her American opponent with a first-round pinfall. She beat a 4-time world champion from Norway in the semifinals. All Japan Women announced for the Jackie Sato Memorial Champion Legends show on September 29 at Tokyo Ota Ward Gym. They would bring in many of the wrestlers from the mid to late 70s, including Meiki Ueda, who was her original tag team partner as the first and most famous beauty pair, and later her opponent when she won the WWA title for the first time in the first women's pro wrestling match ever at Budokan Hall on November 1, 1977, before then Japanese women's wrestling record 13,000 fans in a match that went 60 minutes. Sato died at the age of 41 on August 9 from stomach cancer. I just saw a tape this past week of the network news coverage of Sato's funeral. It wasn't anywhere approaching the level of Baba, of course, but the features were far lengthier than the coverage of the Owen Hart death, let alone any of the others, within our culture. As mentioned when Sato died, a lot of how mainstream coverage goes depends upon the era, and everyone in the country in their late 30s remembers that period where Sato was a superstar, particularly nearly every woman working in Japanese media, since she was the sports/entertain hero of the time. Matches announced so far are Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda defending the WWA tag titles against Nani Takahashi and Momoi Nakanishi. Symbolically, this would be the show to do a title change, and Manami Toyota in Yumiko Hata vs Kyoko and Takako Inoue. FMW is doing an angle where a new Hayabusa attacked the original Hayabusa who unmasked, on September 3rd, and it was believed it was Mr. Ganasuke as the new Hayabusa. Ganasuke claimed at a press conference from a Tokyo hospital that he was getting a knee operation and was in the hospital at the time, and had been in since August 28, and that he can't even walk yet and it would be impossible for him to even wrestle until next year. I guess the hospitalization and knee surgery is an angle since Ganasuke was injured on August 27 by anyway. This is all leading to a big match on November 23rd at Yokohama Arena, which will be FMW's major show of the year. The new Hayabusa will also be appearing in a few porn videos over the next few months as a marketing ploy for the company, since Booker Koto Fuyuki is trying to link wrestling with porn movies since he happens to like both. Ring's cutting back on shows and running smaller buildings is because WOW, its TV network, cut back 30% on its sponsorship money. Rings is suffering from the money cutbacks and also because its wrestlers want it to be a real sport, few worked matches and predetermined endings, but still draw wrestling fans because there is no strong base of fans for real martial arts sport, and that isn't working. WOW did extend their contract for another year, so they are at least considered not in any danger of extinction anytime soon. Right now there is nothing to a potential sale of baseball magazine Shaw. It had been up for sale at one point. Many of the magazines aren't doing well, and actually the Weekly Wrestling magazine is the bestseller in the company, even beating out the baseball magazine itself. Those who work for the company say there have been no outward signs of financial cutbacks noticeable, and more money is coming in due to expansion into merchandising and internet businesses. Some notes from looking at footage from Samurai News shows. They had clips of some IWA Japan shows, and despite what is claimed in the press, the crowds, even with Tiger Jeet Singh, look to be ranging from 125 to 200 per show. Tarzan Goto, who headlines, has really gotten fat, looking to be 5'8" and around 330 or so. LLPW's August 31st Yokohama Bunka Gym show, which claimed 2,200, drew closer to 1,000 here and there. ABC's 2020 is in the process of doing a segment on pro wrestling schools. There was a ton of actually it was a major national news story over the past week about the guy who was offering to auction off one of his kidneys on an eBay internet auction. Wouldn't you know it, it turned out to be Bobby Rogers, a South Florida independent pro wrestler who at one time made an offer to Paul Heyman that he'd legitimately allow his finger to be cut off on one of his shows. Heyman never even considered the offer. Rolling Stone magazine is considering doing a story on pro wrestling groupies. On Memphis TV on September 11th, a woman out of the crowd jumped on Vic Grimes. Jim Cornette interviewed the woman, whose name is Sin, claiming she was Grimes' ex-girlfriend and Grimes had stolen her car, had a baby with another woman and ran up bills and left. Cornette said that Grimes should be suspended by PPW for those atrocities, but Dave Brown doubted her sincerity. Because this promotion was down to only running about 2 shows per week with crowds really down, they are doing co-promotions with the CWA, adding 3 new cities. Chris Cannonball turned heel, and then was pinned by Ultimate Jobber Bulldog Reigns. Lance Jade was still in the audience chanting boring at the show. Dave Brown had security throw him out. Grimes said the woman was a nutcase, and then he was attacked by Cornette and Steve Bradley. This was to set up Bradley versus Grimes for the PPW title, and if Grimes lost, he gets lashed, but if he wins, Sin gets lashed. When the show ended, a huge African-American guy cleaned house on the heels who was never identified. Colorado Kid is now going by his real name of Mike Rapata and dropped his NWA North American title to Big Bully Douglas on September 12. DOA Ron Harris fell down a flight of stairs in a brawl on the show, which at first was feared to be broken but is actually a severe bruise. How's this for a name we haven't heard in like decades? Flying Fred Curry, a star in Detroit in the 70s whose father Wild Bull Curry was something of a pro wrestling legend in Texas, will be wrestling on September 25th on a show he's promoting in Columbus, Ohio at the Newport Music Hall. Tommy Rich vs. Sabu is the main event, plus Fred Curry teams with his son, Flying Fred Curry Jr. FNW on October 8th in West Newton, Pennsylvania has Tom Brandi as the headliner, and Steel City Wrestling on October 9th in Mount Washington, Pennsylvania has Brandy T. Ranchula and Cody Michaels headlining. Anthony Durante, Pitbull 2, and his girlfriend, who wrestles as Sweet Destiny, are doing a Jerry Springer taping where she's leaving him for another wrestler, who turns out to be the Iron Sheik. It's a work, of course. MMA. The Frank Shamrock vs. Tito Ortiz main event seems to be among insiders the most talked about UFC match in years, although fewer people than ever have access to seeing it. Actually, if you live in Northern California, apparently there are many nightclubs carrying it due to Shamrock, and they'll have a satellite hookup at his own gym in San Jose. A lot of people have very strong opinions on who is going to win, basically divided into Ortiz will out-wrestle and outpower him, or Shamrock will outlast the early pounding and get him based on more experience and conditioning. Clearly, a 25 minutes time limit match, conditioning will play a major factor past the 10 minutes mark, and both are training with conditioning as a prime goal. Ortiz will weigh in at 199, but probably going into the octagon at around 215 pounds after rehydrating. Shamrock will probably go in between 195 to 198, and that is a sizable advantage when combined with Ortiz being the stronger wrestler. My own feelings on the fight is that both will attempt at first to try and do stand-up. Shamrock is more versatile because of his kickboxing, but Ortiz trains heavily at boxing, and being probably 5 inches taller, has a huge reach advantage. My feeling is that if Ortiz is doing better standing at first, it'll probably stay that way. If Shamrock is, then Ortiz will take it to the ground. From there, that'll be the power of Ortiz against the technique and experience of Shamrock, and probably conditioning will tell the tale at the end, but anything can happen. One match has been switched on the September 24th show, as Trey Teligman vs. Marcus Conan Silveira is off and is being replaced by Tim Lasik, who was very impressive in his loss to Tsuyoshi Kosaka on the last UFC, versus Ron Waterman, a Goldberg lookalike who was knocked out on the last UFC after several years. The rematch with Silveira vs. Maurice Smith takes place on October 9th in Kenner, Louisiana for World Extreme Fighting Stomp in the Swamp. Smith knocked out Silveira in what at the time was a huge upset to win the EFC championship for that defunct promotion on pay-per-view. Both Enson Inoue and his manager were handed down lifetime suspensions from the Shudo organization. Inoue, who was the group's heavyweight champion, the title was returned, allegedly punched a reporter with Hauchi Sports, and it being not the first outburst of its type led to the suspension. Inoue will continue to appear with pride and has sent feelers to Pancrase and rings as well. The UFC Japan show, which has no affiliation with UFC in the US except has leased the rights to the name, has moved its debut show from October 2nd to November 14th at Tokyo Bay NK Hall, in hopes of signing up bigger names for the first event. TSN will be doing a pilot for a proposed TV show called Full Contact Fighter, after the newspaper covering MMA of the same name. The pilot airs at 8:30 p.m., just before Raw, which is a tremendous time slot, hosted by Joel Gold of the magazine of the same name and Michael Lonsberg of Off the Record. ECW. Raven's contract release from WCW also included a clause that he couldn't say anything disparaging about the company. One of the reasons he's claimed his contract with ECW could become close to as lucrative as the WCW deal he left behind is because even though his base is barely half, his deal includes provisions where he shares in any potential ECW growth over its current level. How's this for actual honesty? Raven on a radio show this past week, when talking about why he was considered too small when he was Johnny Polo in WWF, said his non-steroid weight was only 215 but his steroid weight is close to 245. Some notes from the TNN tapings on September 11th in Buffalo, New York before a packed house of 3,960. Vito Lograsso beat Jesus Cristobal, who wrestles in Mexico as Zorro. Cristobal wasn't impressive on his tryout run and shown by the result of that match. Simon Diamond challenged Jazz, who came out, but since he didn't say Simon says, he put Tony DeVito in his place, but Jazz won, but after Diamond did a run-in, leading to Diamond and DeVito losing to Nova and Chris Chetti. Super Crazy beat Little Guido, and afterwards, Sally E. Graziano attacked Crazy and Spike Dudley came out and put Graziano in seconds. They did the TNN opening, which wound up with Francine spearing Miss Congeniality, formerly Angelica. Raven and Dreamer did an angle where they were attacked by Danny during and Roadkill, and quickly beat them with DDTs. Raven threw a title belt at Dreamer and hit him in the face. Dreamer challenged Raven and Raven just walked off into the crowd. Jerry Lynn beat Just Incredible in a very good match when Lance Storm's interference backfired. After the match, they beat up Lynn until Rob Van Dam came out. The lights went out and Sabu was in the ring, and it wound up with Van Dam, Sabu and Lynn all fighting each other to set up a three-way down the road. Sabu put Credible through a table, but Taz choked Sabu out in the aisle. It ended with New Jack hitting the ring and cleaning house with weapons. Axel Rotten and Balls Mahoney beat Bill Wiles and C.W. Anderson. Masato Tanaka beat Rhino in what was apparently a very good match. Taz choked out Tanaka after the match. Show ended with Van Dam pinning Uganda. Consensus was the show wasn't good as a live show, as even though the matches themselves were good, fans were complaining about the matchups like Van Dam vs. Uganda as the main event. Chris Condito and Tammy Sitch were backstage at the show but didn't work. Paul Heyman said they must have been there because they had been telling everyone for so long they were starting on that date that they were basically trying to show up and book their own return. Heyman said that since they started college this week, if he gets proof they are going to classes and can stay clean, he's willing to give them another chance. Tanaka showed up with FMW president Arai. He was working on a back injury. TNN show for September 11th was hopefully a representation of their basic idea for television. They aired 3 matches, all of them very good, and all of them very different. The matches are longer in general than Raw and Nitro matches. Although the main event, RVD vs. Lin went 11:37 on TV, was only slightly longer than some Raw or Nitro main events. Longer matches goes totally against the grain of what Raw and Nitro viewer patterns seem to indicate. But with no opposing show on, ECW may be able to get away with it. Time will tell. Crazy beat Rhino. The graphic under Crazy read Insane Luchador, which is his nickname, but put in that context it looked hilarious. Joel Gertner and Joey Styles are way too pushy on commentary. Crazy looked real good, and Rhino, who Heyman is very high on, has a ton of potential. Crazy won a good match with a Hurricane Rana blocking a power bomb. Rhino's nickname is the Rookie Monster, and Gertner kept calling him Cookie Monster. Rhino destroyed Crazy after the match, and in the commentary you could tell they were pushing Rhino more than Crazy. And speaking of that, the commentary spoke volumes in a taped Mike Awesome vs. Masato Tanaka match from when they were working their ECW program last year. They pushed Awesome far more than Tanaka, which is pretty much a giveaway they have plans for him. They are trying to get him over as being 6'8", 300 pounds, and with the short guys by wrestling standards in the company, they may be able to almost pull it off. I'd guess he's about 6'3.5", and at that point was probably about 285, but is much lighter now. This was an excellent match. In fact, it was the best match on any American television show in some time. It was better seeing it now than it was 1 year ago, because overall standards have dropped in the ring considerably, I guess because of the lack of emphasis on in-ring, so a match that was one of many excellent matches you'd see last year stands out a lot more this year. Van Dam vs. Lin ended when Credible and Storm interfered. They tried to push the Nitro finish as being something the company hated and to transfer the heat on the wrestlers who ruined the match. Style also guaranteed that next week they'd have a rematch which would have a finish. Match was also very good. In showing a video clip during the show of the only momentary advantage Storm and Credible had over Sid in that horrid pay-per-view confrontation, Styles called Sid the master of the imaginary win streak. Syndication saw during and Roadkill and miscongeniality over Chetty and Nova and Jazz. Styles called a sidewalk slam by Roadkill since he's Amish, a dirt road slam. It was okay. They showed a different Tanaka vs. Awesome match and it was also excellent. Dreamer, since this was taped at the ECW arena, tried to get the fans hot by saying they needed to prove to TNN officials that they could do a taping from the building. The show ended with Corino and Rhino coming out, and Rhino gave Francine a clothesline, and they were about to devastate Dreamer when Raven came out and they double DDT'd Rhino and Jack Victory and double pinned them. Weekend house shows besides television drew about 1,400 in Pittsburgh on September 10th, which is considerably down, and 700 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania on September 9th. Pittsburgh was expected to be way down because a lot of the local success was due to Shane Douglas working so hard promoting the shows. Douglas is claiming the amount owed him was $140,000, and that ECW has made one payment to him of $5,000 and never made another payment. Heyman called that story a total lie. Heyman said that he's not adverse to taking someone like Vic Grimes for a prescribed time even though they are under a WWF contract. He said he felt the Al Snow deal benefited everyone, as he got a good wrestler for several months for very little money. Since WWF was paying the guy, that Snow got a gimmick that got him back into WWF, and WWF got to use the gimmick ECW created for him. In the case of Grimes, he said he was undecided at this point whether or not to take him. WCW. Due to the hurricane, the Thunder tapings scheduled for September 16th in Florence, South Carolina were canceled, and they'll be taping Thunder on September 15th in Norfolk for airing the next night, unless the weather makes that impossible, in which case Thunder would become old clips. Nitro on September 13th in Chapel Hill, North Carolina drew 5,571, 4,409 paying $144,085, in a 17,000-seat capacity setup. The first 45 minutes were entertaining, but then it reverted back, kind of like the pay-per-view. Benoit pinned Malenko in 8:04 after cradling Malenko after Malenko delivered a superplex off the top. This was the finish of a famous Dynamite Kid vs. Randy Savage pay-per-view match in the mid-80s. The two hugged after the match. Saturn and Douglas came out and were desperately cheerleading, trying to get the crowd into it. Crowd was weak for most of the show and they were sort of into it, but not as much as the two deserved because they did a really good match. Ric Flair returned to easily the best reaction on the show. He was very entertaining. Sting and Luger came out. Sting had more boos than cheers but not much in the way of intense heat. They put Flair over and then told him to retire. Flair had a hilarious line saying he hadn't watched wrestling in 6 weeks, then watched Nitro last night and knew they needed him. Luger and Sting attacked Flair with Luger racking him and Sting putting him in the Scorpion until Hogan and Hart made the save. Hogan and Hart challenged them to a tag match but Luger said he couldn't do it because he didn't have his gear or a medical release. The difference between Nitro and Raw is that a Flair equivalent level star in WWF, if that had happened to them, would have returned for some sort of revenge by the end of the show, which is why WWF fans don't lose faith in their favorite faces and WCW fans do. Flair's reaction, while very good, was nothing out of the ordinary and not as good as it should have been. Ricky Rackman did the Nitro Girls tryout. This segment, even though going unopposed, actually lost audience, which almost never happens in the first hour no matter how bad a segment is. Disco beat Eric Watts in 3:10 with whatever they are calling the stunner this week. If Barry Bonds was in a baseball game, would the announcers be banned from mentioning his father's name? Not that Eric Watts is Barry Bonds or anything. Sid beat both guys up, choke slammed Disco and powerbombed Watts and pinned him. Sid did an interview trying to get over how he's smarter than all the other wrestlers. That's short of like Crash Holly being a super heavyweight, I guess. Charles Robinson was wearing the US title belt. After the interview, Sid powerbombed Disco. Silver King vs. Norman Smiley went 156 before Sid powerbombed Smiley, choke-slammed King and pinned both guys. Wyndham's beat Regal and Dave Taylor in 4:13 when Hennig hit Regal with a cowbell and Wyndham schoolboyed him. Bad. Flynn came to the ring for a match. Goldberg then came out and challenged Sid. He said he admired Sid's size, strength and skill but not his mouth. His skill. Anyway, Sid, the master of mind games, then left the building. Flynn jumped Goldberg and you know what happened next. He'd kept the tag belts beating Knobs and Morris via DQ in 7:53 when the Wyndhams interfered. Heat cleaned house on both teams. ICP beat Lenny and Lito in 3:21 when Lodi accidentally gave Lenny a crossbody and Shaggy pinned him. The crazed Lodi fan hit the ring before the match and ran away from security. Did that angle look so fake or what? Benoit did an interview and said Sid tapped out the night before but the ref didn't see it. Benoit was supposed to wrestle Sting for the title, but instead Steiner came out. Benoit pinned him but he was hardly put over. By the way, the TV title was never mentioned. Steiner attacked ref Mickey J for no reason. Benoit cradled Steiner and Steiner kicked out at 2, but J counted 3 anyway. Steiner then beat up Benoit after the match until Malenko ran in. Saturn beat Guerrero in 9:17 with a cradle. Both the Filthy Animals and Revolution guys were at ringside. At least a program with them against each other won't elevate anyone to the top, but should result in some good matchups. Guerrero did a really cool Hurricane Rana off a DVD attempt. Guerrero is the smoothest working wrestler in the country but seems to lack the fire and passion for his work that he used to have. Not that it would be a surprise after being with his company for so many years. Berlin beat Bagwell in 5:11 when the big bodyguard interfered. They did a video package where they hinted that NWO Sting, Jeff Farmer, would return to join with Sting. Sting and Luger beat Hogan and Hart in 9:58 when DDP came down with the bat and it wound up with Luger hitting Brett in the face with the bat and Sting pinned him. They're going to sell it as if Hart was injured talking about stitches in his mouth but it's an angle. Rey Mysterio Jr. didn't get his eye poked last week. He actually had an eye infection. Mysterio Jr. was scheduled to wrestle Juventud Guerrero on Nitro but the match was cancelled because the Flair/Sting/Luger angle went way long. Why couldn't they just cancel those stupid squash matches with the Sid run-ins or the Wyndhams versus Regal and Taylor? Why do I ask? Chavo Guerrero Jr. and Disco Inferno look to be starting a new group. Add Ric Flair to the list of people looking to end up with a booking job. The reason they dropped Rap is Crap as a theme song for the Rednecks is because it didn't fit without rappers to feud with. Scott Steiner is scheduled back imminently. Not sure why it's been delayed, although it's been speculated he hasn't gotten his physique back due to the injuries. David Finlay has gotten some feeling back in his lower leg, but it's way too early to know whether he'll ever be able to wrestle again. Wrath should be ready to return next month after his knee surgery. Ultimo Dragon's physical condition hasn't improved, but to WCW's credit, he's still on their payroll for the remainder of his contract. E! Channel is doing a bio on Hogan, Why do I get the impression this will be largely fiction, and was interviewing people like Savage, Hart, Nash and Okerlund at Nitro this past week. Scott and Dana Hall have split up once again. Goldberg was bothered greatly by a bad back at the pay-per-view, which is probably why he didn't wrestle at Nitro the next night, but it had improved. Last year, since there was so much press on Goldberg being Jewish everywhere, he didn't work on Rosh Hashanah, a Jewish holiday. This year with no press, the holiday fell on September 10th and he worked a house show in Baltimore. In Tallahassee, the newspaper ran an article negative toward WCW for hyping Sting vs. Flair, although they knew well in advance Flair wasn't going to be there. Even though they got Hogan vs. Hart instead, fans were complaining that Sting wasn't there, but he was healthy on Nitro 2 nights later. Apparently Bret Hart bumped into Road Dogg on a plane and asked him why he said he wasn't that good of a wrestler. In typical fashion, Dogg denied ever saying it. The Demon vs. Vampiro feud, which is totally off the books, was scheduled to go like this. Demon was to be revealed as the son of the devil, I swear I'm not making this up, who had turned good because he turned his back on his father. Vampiro would be revealed to have been sent down, or up, or however the geography goes, to garner revenge. They were going to build for a showdown on the New Year's Eve pay-per-view show where Demon would toss Vampiro into a vat of holy water, and when he got out, he'd change to a new character. Vampiro signed a 3-year contract this past week. Despite what you read elsewhere, ICP is at least at press time working without a contract. It is believed that Bischoff signed Bagwell to a new deal this past week as well. Lots of speculation that Savage isn't long for the company. Flair was at the pay-per-view but left before the show started and never appeared on camera. Douglas apparently suffered a slightly torn bicep at the pay-per-view but should be able to wrestle within about 2 weeks. Medusa is back after minor surgery. Lots of heat within the Nitro girls. Basically Kimberly and Spice, who appeared on Nitro this week, are the on one side and the rest are against them. The Nitro girls' tryouts on television are way too long. Hart praised Bischoff as a person in his column. He basically said that while he didn't like what WCW had done, or failed to do with him, he personally liked Bischoff. He brought up Bischoff's reaction when Owen died and when someone played the practical joke of calling WCW the day of a pay-per-view show that Hart was in the main event of and said that Stu had died. Even after Bischoff found out Stu was alive, he told him he'd understand if he couldn't work the match. He contrasted that with in 1991, when his older brother Dean died and McMahon's lack of concern about it. The only house show of the week was September 10th in Baltimore, headlined by Goldberg over Sid via DQ, which drew 3,190 paying $93,160, although there were actually 6,413 tickets out because it was so heavily comped. Flair was at the show and basically ran the show backstage. He said he was embarrassed by the size of the crowd in Baltimore and that the next time they came he'd work for it to be a full house, and then said he could still beat Rock, Austin, and Undertaker. Conan returned on that show teaming with Kidman to lose to the Wyndhams. WWF. At press time, the Unforgiven pay-per-view lineup was looking to be a 6-way title match with Triple H, Kane, Undertaker, Rock, Mankind and Big Show, with Austin at ringside as the enforcer or in the ring as referee. To me, going with this match shows they still don't have confidence in Triple H to headline a pay-per-view on his own. Also Jarrett vs. Chyna for the IC title, which will likely have Billy Gunn as ref. Shamrock vs. Jericho, Henry vs. Brown for European title, Venus vs. Blackman, Snow vs. Bossman in a cage with a Hell in the Cell cage filled with Rottweilers around the first cage, an old Portland gimmick, and Acolytes vs. Dudleys. Raw on September 13th in Anaheim, California before a sellout 11,186 paying $336,836 opened with Linda McMahon giving a speech. She's not good at all on camera but had to be there to set up the angle to bring Vince back. She ordered a 5-way to determine the number 1 contender and then ordered Triple H vs. Austin for the title. Triple H and Chyna came out and beat up Patterson and Briscoe, and Triple H threatened Linda, who left. All the wrestlers in the 5-way hit the ring and they had a battle royal. Jarrett challenged any woman. Rock and Mankind did an hilarious promo. Luna beat Jarrett via DQ in 128 when Ivory hit Luna with the guitar, which didn't break. Jarrett put Lillian Garcia in the figure 4 after the match since she announced Luna as the winner. Miss Kitty and Deborah didn't seem thrilled at Jarrett for that one. The ghost of every decent deceased ring announcer must have been cheering. They were promoting WrestleMania 2000 already for the Anaheim Pond. Yvonne Dudley beat Farouk in 221 when Bubba hit him with a chair and hit Bradshaw with the ring steps. Bradshaw then hit Bubba with a chair after the match. Ross interviewed Bulldog, It's clear they ditched the taped interviews where he talked about Owen and Bret. I presume the lawyers got on their case about that, because this interview, neither were mentioned. He just said he'd held every title but the WWF title and wants to win that one. In a suit, the guy looked almost like a cartoon character, he was so huge. Bossman and Snow came out. Snow challenged Bossman to a title match and gave the stips about the Rottweilers at ringside. Somewhere in here Bulldog jumped Bossman, but Bossman posted him. I don't like Bulldog's chances. Shane was mysteriously attacked, apparently by the posse. Shane is just a great heel, it's really a shame he has to turn, even temporarily. Test beat Joey Abs in 235 with a powerbomb even with Rodney and Pete interfering. Shane made the save but they all jumped him. Shane and Test fought them together, chased them to the back and hopped in a car and drove off. I've got the angle. They get married, which makes Test a partial owner of the company, but they find out he's really from Mars and aliens become partial owners of the WWF. Austin was in the ring ready for his title match but Triple H said he swore out an assault complaint and told a zillion officers to arrest Austin. They did. At one point Triple H attacked him. The cops weren't thrilled by it but they still took Austin away and didn't do anything to Triple H, particularly since they must be California cops and the assault took place in New York. Godfather beat Chaz in 233 with a Death Valley driver so sloppy it could only be called a pimp drop. Chaz said he and Mariana had an amicable breakup. Then she showed up with a black eye. He acted surprised. Ross didn't believe Chaz punched her but Godfather did, and you know how the local pimp is really the best friend of every woman in town, so he kicked Chaz's ass. Anyway, the only thing we found out for sure is that you can add Mariana to the list of women in wrestling who can't deliver a line. Jericho came out in a cage. He called the Y2 jail and brought out Gotch Gracie in a mask, who wound up being Curtis Hughes. This was like watching WCW in that it was the first time in a long time where the WWF announcers wouldn't sell the WWF angle. I guess they were afraid if they talked about the significance of the name that Carl Gotch, at 71, might kick all their asses. They did this really bad-looking fake match. This actually got no heat because fans Liv didn't get it either. Jericho used his Lion Tamer, which is not the name of the move in the WWF. I think they called it a Boston Crab because they haven't come up with a name for it. He then put a really bad-looking ankle lock on, which resulted in Shamrock coming out. Somewhere in here the mask was taken off, revealing Curtis Hughes. Ross called him by that name, but Jericho called him Mr. Huge, and since he's dropped like 80 pounds, he isn't all that huge anymore. He'll be Jericho's bodyguard. Brown paid off Godfather but we didn't know what for. The 5-man match basically saw them beat up every ref in sight until every undercard wrestler ran in and they went to a commercial. After the commercial, all the refs complained to Earl Hebner, since he was the only ref who didn't get beaten up by everyone. Earl told them that until they sell their souls to the devil, they're going to be beaten up every week on TV. He didn't really say that. I made all that up. Venus and Brown beat Blackman in a handicap match in 201 when Brown pinned him after a frog splash. Henry was supposed to be Blackman's partner but never showed up. They showed him in the dressing room having Godfather's hose table dance for him. Now are they hoes or strippers? Triple H and Chyna came out and he called out Linda. He demanded Linda say that Austin won't be getting any more title shots. She wouldn't back down. Vince made the save and cut an awesome promo on Triple H. Austin came out and brawled with Triple H for 302 before hitting Earl Hebner for the DQ. Austin brawled the whole way and looked better than you'd think for a guy who isn't supposed to be in the ring for another month. Not that he wasn't noticeably slow and his timing wasn't slightly off. Austin kept beating Triple H up after the match, and basically sold nothing, ending by hitting the stunner. Austin, X-Pac, Deborah and Road Dogg attended the MTV Music Awards. Austin was the only one who got any real TV play. Howard Stern interviewed Austin and noted his being there with Deborah, who Austin was talking about being the hottest woman there. Stern told him as a recently divorced man it's a mistake to date a coworker because after the breakup, you still have to see her. Austin said he carries a lot of political stroke in WWF and didn't think he'd have that problem. Jericho, who is into heavy metal, is writing a column for Metal Edge magazine. Snow's gimmick of doing all his different personalities was a ripoff of Jimmy Hart's idea on WCW Saturday Night, doing the same for Barry Darsow. The movie Man in the Moon about Andy Kaufman, starring Jim Carrey, which features Jerry Lawler, will be released on December 25th. In what could turn out to be a huge story down the line, or no story at all, the CBS/Viacom merger could affect the status of UPN as a network. FCC rules are that no singular company can own more than one broadcast network, and since Viacom owns UPN, that would give them two and it's obvious which one they'd scrap or try and sell. This doesn't apply to cable networks since CBS also owns TNN, for example, and NBC owns MSNBC. The feeling is the FCC will scrap the rule because it was designed during a time when there were only 3 networks and it wouldn't have been in public interest for the same company to own 2 of them. UPN took out ads last week with someone saying that they turned on wrestling on Monday night and all they saw was tennis to push SmackDown. Notes from SmackDown on September 9th, since we didn't get them last week, taped on September 7th in Albany, New York. The show opened with Triple H and Chyna beating up Kane in the parking lot and Taker and Show making the save for him. Boss Man challenged everyone. Davey Boy Smith showed up and pinned him in 55 seconds to win the hardcore title. Smith didn't give an indication if he could do anything, but since it was so short and he did nothing, that may be an indication. Smith then gave the title belt to Snow, who came out wearing a Leif Cassidy costume. Christian and Edge beat Hardys in a real good match. X-Pac told Kane it was over between the 2 of them. Sob. Hollies came out with the scale saying they wanted to fight only people more than 300 pounds. Chyna came out and Holly laughed. Chyna hit Bob with the scale. They had a 53 seconds match ending when Jarrett attacked Chyna for the DQ. Gunn made the save for Chyna and then gave her the famouser and left. This left Bob and Crash to fight each other to the back. There is no shelf life in this Crash Holly character. Bradshaw beat Bubba Ray Dudley, spelled Baba Ray in WWF, in 225 via DQ when Devon interfered and Farouk made the save. No heat, but it was pretty good for the 2. Test Stephanie, Patterson, Briscoe and Linda McMahon came out and they announced October 11th as their wedding date. Yep, they're getting married at the Tokyo Dome. No, actually it's Raw from the Georgia Dome. Maybe Bischoff can show up and be the one to try and ruin Vince's daughter's wedding. Terry Runnels and Posse came out but Shane told them to back off and the war was over. Shane apologized and shook hands with Test. Triple H beat Kane after Chyna hit him with a sledgehammer in 6:47 and Triple H used the pedigree. Taker and Show made the save and they hinted Kane would join them. Very little heat for the match. Shamrock challenged Jericho. Jericho appeared from under the ring in a cage. Jericho told Harold Howard Finkel to raise the cage but Finkel was too busy yelling at Lillian Garcia. Shamrock bent the bars to the cage and attacked Jericho. The officials broke it up and Jericho gave Gary a belly-to-belly allowing Jericho to run away. Jarrett cut a promo on Chyna and invited Fabulous Moolah into the ring. Lawler said Moolah was women's champ for 100 years. Jarrett said that Moolah knew that she shouldn't be wrestling the men. Moolah said she didn't wrestle men because they wouldn't let her. Jarrett KO'd Moolah with a guitar shot for that remark. He then tackled Mae Young, who is 75 years old, and put her in the figure 4. Her selling was awesome. If all the wrestlers of today could sell moves like that, this would be a far better world. Actually, it would be almost the exact same world, but the wrestling matches would have more drama. This was an awesome angle. Finally, Taker and Show regained the tag titles from Rock and Mankind when Triple H interfered and buried Mankind alive. Triple H jumped in an ambulance and they did the Hummer angle with Austin in an 18-wheeler destroyed the ambulance with Triple H supposedly in it. After the show went off the air, Austin gave Shane McMahon a whole bunch of stunners. Kimono had a WWF tryout interview. The Jax show that aired over the weekend on WUR was at this point only a one-shot deal. Austin taped an episode of the Martin Short show over the weekend. Foley will appear on G vs. E on October 10th after wrestling, which should lead to them getting their best rating ever. Shows this past week saw September 7th SmackDown in Albany, New York drew 10,183 paying $252,295, 1,200 shy of capacity. September 11th house show in Salt Lake City drew 8,284 paying $254,980 and September 12th house show in San Diego drew 9,750 paying $220,493. Merchandise for the week was $249,008 or $6.32 per head. In what isn't really a wrestling story, but its contrast to wrestling was heavily covered, particularly locally in Kansas City, boxer Randy Carver died on September 14th from injuries suffered in a match on September 12th at Harrah's Casino in Kansas City. Carver, the North American Boxing Federation super middleweight champion, was knocked unconscious in the match and laid on the mat for 20 minutes on a live Fox Sports Network telecast. He underwent brain surgery after the match which wasn't successful and was ruled brain dead the next day. Perhaps because of what the WWF didn't do even though the fighter was not dead, but clearly was in bad shape. The show was stopped with 4 matches remaining. Even though the crowd was filled with people who were drunk and who paid much higher ticket prices than were for wrestling fans, There were no problems with fans being mad because the show was stopped prematurely because people saw something far more serious was going on. Funniest line since the one last week about Rock saying if Lawler ran Memphis like he ran the USWA, he'd make a great mayor. Shawn Michaels on the WWF web broadcast in talking about Triple H not beating Austin in a singles match at SummerSlam to win the title said that when he wrestled Austin at WrestleMania, he'd love to have had the luxury of getting a third guy in the match since he was also hurt badly. But the great line was, anybody who knows me in the wrestling business knows that if it was Shawn Michaels in that match at SummerSlam, that shit wouldn't have happened. It would have gone down the way it was supposed to go down. Rudy Martzke in his USA Today column on September 8 talked about the NFL's Monday ratings vis-a-vis wrestling, and even gave credence to that ridiculous story about the NFL offering the WWF $100 million to move Raw. Jim Byrne of WWF said in the story he couldn't confirm or deny it. Dennis Lewin, the NFL Senior VP of Broadcasting, said the report was a joke. Byrne did note that Raw outrates football among younger viewers and asked, aren't the young people the fans of the future? The combination of Raw and Nitro absolutely affected football's ratings last year. Because of the decline of Nitro, the overall audience for wrestling has dropped, so wrestling will have less of an effect on football this season. The reality is, based on last week's ratings, there were more viewers for all the CBS, NBC and Fox programming on Monday night than Raw or Nitro. So if the NFL wanted to pay somebody money to move a show, they'd want CBS to move Everyone Loves Raymond, since last week a rerun of that show drew 12.2 million viewers while Raw is doing usually about 6 to 7 million. Regarding Byrne's statement about young fans being into Raw and I guess trying to imply that means WWF will threaten the NFL in the future, he could be right. But my own background suggests that logic, while it sounds great, doesn't mean crap in real life. Years ago I worked in the front office of a team in the now defunct North American Soccer League that averaged about 14,000 paid admissions per home date, which was hardly shabby in a 17,000-seat stadium. Our marketing was geared to the future, with heavy emphasis on drawing young kids who would convince their parents to go, with the idea that parents were too old to hook on soccer, so we needed to hook the kids. We absolutely killed the NFL and baseball locally when it came to drawing young kids to the game, because they marketed adults and we marketed kids. Our logic was over the long haul soccer would be the sport of the future because of this. Besides, more kids played soccer than football or baseball, so, by that logic, in the future we were going to threaten football for the top spot for sure. But that logic doesn't work in the real world. It's now 18 years later. All those young kids who grew up playing soccer and all those young kids growing up with the soccer game and not the football game as what they grew up attending as children are now in their late 20s through their late 30s. And now that they're adults, they're NFL, NBA, and baseball fans, just like their parents were, and could care less about soccer except to watch their own kids play. Austin is on the cover of the September 10th Entertainment Weekly, which includes a write-up of SmackDown and also mentions Austin's appearances on Nash Bridges this season. A 4-year-old boy in Warner Robins, Georgia was blamed for beating a 15-month toddler to death imitating moves he saw while watching a video of the last SummerSlam. Police suspect the child was acting out moves he saw on the tape. The 15-month-old died on September 5 from a fractured skull and also suffered liver damage. The two were among 7 kids watching the SummerSlam video. Their babysitter had left them alone watching the video when he left to go to a store for 15 minutes. At that point the 4-year-old went into the room where the baby was sleeping and began punching and kicking him. The child was hit with a hard plastic toy and kicked off his bed. 2 Atlanta psychologists noted that violent videos can lead children to violent behavior, and 4-year-olds don't know the difference between fantasy violence and reality. One more death like this and there's going to be a huge media backlash. Steve Williams, as in Dr. Death, not Stone Cold, was indicted on September 9 as a deadbeat dad for failing to pay $64,000 in child support. Williams was charged with ignoring a 1995 Oklahoma court order to pay a lump sum of $18,000 and monthly payments of $811 to support a child he fathered with a Sacramento, California woman. He's been charged with a felony under the 1998 Deadbeat Parents Act and if convicted faces a maximum 2 years in prison and $250,000 fine. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune had an editorial on Ventura doing SummerSlam that ran nationally and was critical of him doing the show because of what wrestling had become. The September 6 Hartford Courant ran a front-page story on WWF Wrestling called Hormones and Humor, or a horror show. It basically discussed parents' different reactions to their young kids who want to watch wrestling. One parent, who teaches psychology to women, wouldn't let her kids watch because she didn't want them watching a TV show that devalues women. A local criminal defense lawyer said that the kids know wrestling is fake and are intelligent enough to see it as entertainment. It brought up the two kids' deaths. The day before, the same newspaper's Sunday Northeast magazine ran a cover story on Vince, very positive, and with all the inaccuracies one would expect from a single-source story on pro wrestling when the single source is the WWF. The story claims that Raw trounces the once unbeatable Monday Night Football in the ratings, that the company takes in $800 million per year. He claimed his success was based on admitting it wasn't real. He claimed that admission got rid of commission regulation, true in a few states, but commissions still regulate wrestling in 24 states. He said the success of WWF caused Ted Turner to buy a network of Southern wrestling promotions in 1991. He claimed during his steroid trial, Turner's WCW overtook WWF in the ratings. The trial was in 1994. WCW was ahead of WWF in the ratings for many years during the 80s and 90s, but nobody looked at TV ratings as being important in those days. WCW overtook them on Monday nights in 1996. There is also a Vince feature in Talk magazine. This talked about the IPO, and at least the numbers were accurate. Vince's version of history was a little strained as usual. His version of the War of '84 was that he offered to buy people out. He did make that offer to several promoters. Stu Hart and several of the stockholders of the old Georgia Championship Wrestling office were the only ones who accepted, and within 3 years had run the rest of them out of business and had a monopoly. Overall, the story was pretty well written. The reader's pages. Bischoff. Eric Bischoff's single greatest mistake while in charge of WCW was to trust others. Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Hulk Hogan and the rest all cared about their own agendas and how fat they could make their contracts without opening their eyes to the changing trends going on in the business. Bischoff was burned badly by Hall and Nash and ended up paying for it. Nash as a booker was total doom. As a performer he was lethargic and flat-out boring. He had no fire in his eyes or in his work. Dusty Rhodes' booking further drilling the company into a hole. Instead of constantly taking from the business, the top names in WCW should have given back to the company that was paying them so well, been truthful and helped build new stars. I thought Bischoff did a marvelous job in making WCW a powerhouse promotion. Unfortunately, he didn't have the insight or the balls to make the right personnel moves to keep the company thriving. People like Hogan, Dallas Page, Nash and Randy Savage fighting to be in his ear, and the exciting workers like Saturn, Benoit and all the Mexicans and so many others had to put up with so much grief and got such little respect. Hogan is a fossil. Nash is snooze material. Savage and the Florida booking posse aren't as smart as they think they are, and the ratings and arena business proves it. The axe fell on Bischoff, but make no mistake, it remains sharp for the next truly deserving of it. Name withheld by request. As you and most wrestling fans have seen, after a great start, Eric Bischoff has been nothing but a complete failure and a disaster as the head of a wrestling company. He was lucky that his two big ideas of raiding the WWF and paying big bucks to Hogan, Nash and Hall and then putting Nitro on opposite Raw worked. And anyone who thinks it's easy to get a company to put out big money for crazy ideas has never seen how business works. Keep in mind this was a company losing millions of dollars each year and seemed to have no chance to make money. In many businesses, paying $100 for office supplies requires a huge fight with management. But after spending this money and bringing WCW to the top of the industry, Bischoff showed his true colors. He started playing big shot. He had to appear on television every week. He had to have control and punish people who disagreed with him. Hogan, Savage, Piper and Bischoff were pushed down our throats every week even though nobody wanted to see them anymore. His friends were pushed. Others, like Flair and Benoit, were buried. Millions were paid to a gang of losers like Master P, DJ Rand, Jay Leno and Dennis Rodman, while little were offered to Chris Jericho and the Giant. Anyway, he's gone, and for the company, it will be a long road back. As for the book Roller Derby to Roller Jam, by Keith Coppage, I agree it was well written. However, the details of the demise of the roller derby were sketchy at best. It mentioned that there was a strike and that some skaters went to another outfit. It mentioned that Seltzer lost money in 1972. It never talked about that other outfit, that it was a separate promotion and many of the derby skaters appeared there. I think that would have helped the book. Dave Katz. Mount Holly, New Jersey. Hildebrand. I only met Bryan once. He and Scott Dickinson were in Chicago a day early for Nitro, and we had an opportunity to gather at John Henrikson's house to watch a WWF pay-per-view. Bryan was a pleasure to meet. He was genuinely gracious in talking about his lifelong hobby. Like many here, I followed Bryan's battle through the Observer. I admired his courage. Although I didn't know Bryan well, his death moved me. My 2.5-year-old son has cancer, and we go to surgery on September 29th. It is truly amazing to come to understand just how trivial the business of pro wrestling really is for what I suspect is the vast majority of your readers. I have so little time to read about and watch wrestling, or any other diversion from reality. My son does not know the gravity of his situation. I hope that I never have to show the grace and composure in crisis that BRYAN so clearly projected. Raymond Asher. Chicago, Illinois. I've known BRYAN Hildebrand for about 6 years. It was with Smoky Mountain Wrestling that I learned how dedicated BRYAN was to the sport he loved. No matter what the detail was, he was going to make sure that it was done perfectly. Nobody can imagine how much BRYAN did for SMW, working with the merchandise, picking people up at the airport for Fan Week, organizing Fan Week along with his other duties. I became close with BRYAN because of all his help in getting the Smoky Mountain Express newsletter done, and I also became close with his beautiful wife, Pam. There were no two people more dedicated to seeing SMW be a success than those two. I was so excited when I found out BRYAN got a job working with WCW. He was finally getting the national exposure he so richly deserved. I was so excited when BRYAN and Pam were married. Due to personal problems with my father's death and my mother's poor health, I couldn't attend. For the past 2 years, with BRYAN being sick, we were unable to visit, but we certainly kept in touch by phone, and our friendship continued to grow. Needless to say, I'm very sorry of his passing. I had just talked with Pam on September 4th when I found out he wasn't doing well. Fortunately, I have many fond memories of BRYAN to keep me smiling. Leonard Sims 2. Beckley, West Virginia. Ratings. I've always wondered why the AP listings of the weekly cable ratings were always different and lower than the ones in the Observer, but your item about the Sports Illustrated comparison of the Tiger Woods vs. David Duval numbers against the Raw numbers appears to explain it. I'm assuming AP converts the cable ratings to conform to the broadcast television universe, and by running the numbers, I come up with a cable universe that totals 72% of the broadcast television universe. Is that correct? Richard Martin. Brunswick, Georgia. Response from Dave Meltzer. Basically speaking, yes. It's unfair to list ratings as a percentage based on the number of homes that have television sets in the United States when the shows aren't available in a large percentage of the homes to begin with. Currently, TNT, TBS and USA Network are all in approximately between 77 and 78 million of the 101 million homes that have television in the United States, or about 77%. TNN is in about 75 million homes. Jonathan Boyd. In the early 1980s, my main reason for attending live wrestling shows in Birmingham was in hopes of seeing the sheepherders get their asses kicked. For all of Lord Jonathan Boyd's good ring work at the time, he performed magic on the mic, running down the Fullers, Austin Idol, Jimmy Golden and the fans with his bloody Yanks patter. One night a drunk and good old boy sitting behind me, obviously not understanding what Boyd meant by a Yank, stood up and shouted, "I'm a rebel, you son of a bitch." Recently I found at a local video store a tape featuring a hodgepodge of matches and angles from the mid-70s to early 80s. One item was an arm wrestling angle from Dothan, Alabama. I believe this was Gulf Coast Championship Wrestling circa 1978, featuring Andre the Giant and Terry Bollea as Terry the Hulk Boulder, in brown casual dress pants and flip-flop sandals. I know Dothan was one of the first sites where these two worked a program. Do you know where the first site was? There were 3 matches from the early 80s Memphis, one of which was a 60-minute straw for the AWA title with Nick Bockwinkel versus Jerry Lawler. That was probably a watchable match by the standards of that time, but I must say it would have cured any insomnia that an average modern wrestling fan would have today. I love the old style myself, but I admit I was looking at my watch periodically during this match. I guess I can't take any shots at Paul Heyman for running a show on Yom Kippur, considering I, as a Christian, have attended at least 2 live shows on Christmas. I'll never forget how my Southern Baptist grandmother wanted to have me lynched when I went to Starrcade 85, which was on Thanksgiving. I know that's not a holy holiday, but you get the drift. As for Heyman, who runs a company where the workers go out of their way to give you your money's worth, even in front of a crowd of about 600 like the last time they were in Birmingham, is okay in my book. Jim Ward. Birmingham, Alabama. Response from Dave Meltzer. I've always been under the impression that the first match and angles between Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan were held at the Houston Farm Center in Dothan, Alabama around 1978. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, we're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,